Compassion is often just disguised weakness. Compassion is widely regarded as a noble virtue, a sign of moral strength and human decency. But peel back the surface, and it begins to look suspiciously like something else: fear, guilt, or even submission masquerading as virtue. Many who act compassionately are not driven by strength or empathy, but by a subconscious desire to avoid confrontation, criticism, or discomfort. Rather than being a courageous act, compassion often becomes a social currency, a way to signal goodness and avoid being seen as harsh or indifferent. In this reading, compassion serves more to protect the person offering it than to benefit the person receiving it. A mother spoiling her child, a judge handing out lenient sentences, or a leader refusing to make tough decisions for fear of being seen as cruel. These are not acts of strength, they are evasions. Weakness wears the mask of kindness because strength, especially when it involves setting boundaries, saying no, or enforcing consequences, is easily misunderstood or condemned in a culture that equates softness with virtue. This perspective draws heavily from Nietzsche's critique of slave morality. Nietzsche argued that traditional morality, which praises compassion, humility, and meekness, was a tool of the weak to protect themselves from the strong. Those who lacked power redefined it as evil, and in doing so, elevated their own impotence as moral superiority. Compassion, in that context, becomes a kind of passive aggression, a way to assert control without taking risk, to claim moral high ground without real power. When we help others out of pity rather than respect, we reduce them. We view them as incapable, broken, or beneath us. This is not true empathy. It's an unconscious assertion of superiority. And in many cases, it's easier to feel for someone than it is to hold them accountable, to push them, to confront the harshness they may need to face to grow. Real strength requires stepping into discomfort, both your own and others. It involves discernment, when to care, and when to demand more. At its worst, compassion becomes an enabler of mediocrity. In schools, it lets failing students pass because they tried. In relationships, it keeps people in toxic dynamics because they're struggling. In politics, it excuses incompetence and fuels endless cycles of dependency. What's labeled as kindness is often a refusal to be the bad guy, to say what needs to be said, or to take decisive action when others falter. None of this is to argue that all compassion is weakness, but rather that much of what passes for compassion is not what it claims to be. Real compassion must be paired with strength, clarity, and boundaries. Otherwise, it becomes a virtue weaponized by the weak to excuse failure and to suppress the difficult but necessary demands of excellence and truth. Free will is a flattering illusion you're already owned by your conditioning. The idea of free will flatters the human ego. It tells us we are sovereign agents, authors of our choices, independent from cause and effect. But the deeper you look into neuroscience, into psychology, into childhood development, the more that narrative crumbles. What you think of as you is not a self-made structure. It's a patchwork of memories, language, trauma, cultural programming, and instinct stitched together before you ever had the capacity to question any of it. You did not choose your gender, your genes, your family, your country, or the language you speak. You didn't even choose the beliefs that govern your behavior. They were imprinted on you. From the moment of birth, your nervous system began absorbing patterns: what's rewarded, what's punished, what's safe, what's forbidden. And so, your choices are rarely original. They are the downstream effects of earlier conditioning, echoes of your environment, family scripts, social roles, and unconscious fears. Michel Foucault argued that power operates not just from the top down, but from within, shaping how you speak, what you desire, and even what you think is possible. Free will, then, becomes a myth created by systems that benefit from your belief in autonomy. Because if you think you're free, you'll never question who built your cage. This isn't just philosophy, neuroscience backs it up. Brain scans show that decisions can be predicted seconds before a person becomes consciously aware of having made them. What feels like choice is often post-rationalization. The you that thinks it's in charge is a commentator, not a conductor. Even rebellion is conditioned. The teenager rejecting their parents' values is still reacting within a frame built by those very values. The revolutionary is often just the inverse of the tyrant, not a break from the system itself. Like a pendulum swing, not a new motion altogether. Does this mean we are robots? No. But it does mean that freedom is not as free as we like to believe. True freedom may not come from making choices, but from seeing the machinery of choice, from gaining awareness of the programming and tracing the roots of your instincts. Only then can you begin to intervene. But most don't want that kind of freedom. It's frightening. It requires dismantling the self-image of the autonomous individual, one of the West's most sacred myths. It means recognizing that many of your achievements are not yours alone, and many of your failures weren't entirely your fault. So when we speak of free will, we're often not describing an inner power, we're protecting an illusion. And while that illusion may be useful, even comforting, it's also a veil. Behind it lies a deeper truth. You are not the sole author of your life. You're a co-author at best, and only if you're awake enough to take the pen back from your conditioning. Morality is a herd invention to tame the exceptional. Moral systems are often presented as universal truths, objective, timeless rules for right and wrong. But this is a seductive fiction. In reality, morality is a social invention. It is created, not discovered. And far from serving some divine or transcendent good, it often functions as a mechanism of control, particularly control over those who rise above the norm. Nietzsche called this slave morality, a system of values born not from strength, but from resentment. The weak, unable to conquer the strong, redefine their weakness as virtue. They elevate humility over pride, obedience over ambition, meekness over assertiveness. In doing so, they create a moral order that protects them from those with greater power, vision, or will. This morality is not neutral. It is a survival strategy. It tames the exceptional by shaming their instincts. The one who thinks independently is called arrogant. The one who pursues greatness is labeled selfish. The one who speaks hard truths is seen as cruel. And over time, these judgments become internalized. The exceptional begin to doubt their own power, apologizing for the very traits that make them unique. This moral conditioning is reinforced through religion, education, and media. We are taught not to stand out, not to offend, not to question too much. Morality becomes less about virtue and more about conformity. It punishes the bold under the banner of fairness and rewards the compliant under the illusion of virtue. But if morality serves the herd, what becomes of those who don't belong to it? The visionary, the creator, the outlier, they are seen as threats. Their very existence disrupts the narrative of sameness. And so, morality becomes a weapon used to domesticate their difference. This doesn't mean that all moral codes are worthless, only that they must be viewed critically. Who benefits from this rule? Who is protected and who is suppressed? In many cases, moral systems do not elevate humanity, they dilute it. They trade vitality for obedience, creativity for order, and brilliance for balance. Foucault's notion of discipline adds to this. He shows how morality becomes institutionalized through surveillance, correction, and normalization. The prison, the school, the hospital, these are not just places of care or learning. They are moral factories, producing docile citizens under the guise of service. To be moral in this framework is often to be tamed. And to be exceptional is to be burdened with guilt. Guilt for breaking rules you never agreed to, for having talents you didn't ask for, and for seeing a world that others choose not to see. True ethics, if they exist, must be born not from fear or conformity, but from conscious choice, personal sovereignty, and a confrontation with uncomfortable truths. Until then, much of what is called morality will remain what it has always been, a leash made of virtue, fastened around the necks of those who dare to stand above the crowd. Most people don't want the truth, they want anesthesia. The idea that people crave the truth is a comforting lie. In practice, truth is rarely what people seek. What they want is relief from anxiety, from pain, from responsibility. The raw, unfiltered truth is often cold, unforgiving, and demanding. It tells you that your beliefs are illusions, your actions are often self-serving, and that life is far more chaotic and indifferent than we admit. Most can't stomach that. So instead, they reach for sedatives, belief systems, routines, entertainment, ideologies, anything that helps blur the sharp edges of reality. People aren't driven by a desire to understand the world as it is. They're driven by a desire to feel good about the world they already believe in. This is why self-help outsells philosophy, why news becomes infotainment, and why religious comfort often overrides theological scrutiny. Truth forces change. It destabilizes. And most people would rather feel safe in a lie than exposed in the truth. Michel Foucault pointed out that societies construct truths not because they are true, but because they are useful. Truth becomes something administered through schools, through language, through media. It becomes institutionalized, policed, normalized. And the more it is accepted, the less it is questioned. In this way, the most potent anesthetics are those dressed as truth, nationalism, tradition, even the idea of progress. These constructs create a sense of order in a world that is anything but orderly. The individual level reflects the same pattern. People numb themselves with distractions. They drown in screens, scroll through curated lives on social media, chase status symbols, or bury themselves in identity politics, all to avoid confronting the harder truths about who they are and what life actually is. Even spirituality, which should be a path to awakening, is often reduced to a soothing mythology designed to preserve comfort, not shatter illusion. The moment someone dares to speak a truth that unsettles, that challenges a cherished belief, or exposes a contradiction, they are met with resistance, not curiosity. They are told they're being negative, judgmental, or even dangerous. The truth-teller becomes the villain, not because they're wrong, but because they interrupted the anesthesia. Society doesn't just reject the truth, it often crucifies it. To desire the truth is to be willing to suffer. It is to accept the collapse of certainty. It is to abandon the need for validation, and very few are prepared for that. They may flirt with truth when it's trendy, or when it flatters their existing view, but the moment it requires sacrifice of identity, of comfort, of ego, they retreat. So the vast majority choose sedation, not in the form of drugs, necessarily, but in the form of comforting lies. And in doing so, they trade awareness for serenity, growth for validation, and reality for illusion. Not because they are stupid or evil, but because anesthesia, once administered long enough, becomes indistinguishable from peace. Pity prolongs suffering more than it cures it. Pity, though often mistaken for compassion, is a fundamentally corrosive emotion. It creates a subtle but damaging hierarchy between the one who pities and the one who is pitied. Rather than uplifting, pity reduces. It frames the sufferer not as someone enduring a temporary hardship, but as someone inherently incapable. This dynamic reinforces powerlessness. The person receiving pity is encouraged, implicitly or explicitly, to see themselves as weak, broken, or dependent. True compassion recognizes the potential in someone even in their lowest moments. Pity, on the other hand, freezes people in their suffering. It doesn't believe in their capacity to transcend it. It says, "You poor thing," instead of, "You are stronger than this." The result is a culture that affirms people's pain, but does nothing to push them through it. Pity makes suffering a static identity rather than a stage in transformation. This is especially visible in social systems. Institutions that dole out aid, therapy, and support often do so in ways that infantilize rather than empower. A person becomes their diagnosis, their background, their trauma, a label that demands sympathy but discourages agency. The system reinforces the very conditions it claims to alleviate by rewarding helplessness with attention and punishing strength with indifference. Arthur Schopenhauer saw suffering as intrinsic to existence, but even he would likely object to suffering being institutionalized. When pity becomes policy, suffering becomes permanent. It's no longer a condition to rise from, but a role to inhabit. People learn that expressing pain is more rewarded than overcoming it. Victimhood becomes a currency. And as with any currency, there are those who will hoard it and those who will exploit it. In relationships, pity is equally poisonous. It distorts the power dynamic. The one offering pity gains a sense of moral elevation, while the other is subtly degraded. The person suffering is not seen as a whole human, but as a fragile object of concern. This erodes dignity. Over time, they may begin to act in accordance with that projected weakness, believing themselves incapable of more. Pity also allows the one offering it to avoid true engagement. It's easier to feel sorry for someone than to truly support them. Real support requires honesty, sometimes confrontation, and often the courage to challenge someone's self-perception. But pity demands nothing. It lets you feel noble without doing the hard work of real help. In that sense, pity is a performance. It signals virtue without requiring any risk. The most damaging aspect of pity is that it disables resilience. Human beings are wired to adapt, to overcome. But when others constantly see you as helpless, you begin to see yourself that way too. And once you internalize that identity, every attempt at progress feels like betrayal of yourself, of your story, of the comfort others offer you in your weakness. True healing begins when pity is replaced with respect, not the respect of flattery, but of honest belief in someone's strength. Until then, pity remains a velvet cage, soft, comforting, and locked from the inside. Society doesn't repress your instincts, it manufactures them. The traditional view assumes that we are born with natural, unruly instincts that society must then tame for the sake of order. But this is an illusion. Society doesn't merely repress your instincts, it engineers them. From the moment you arrive into the world, you're shaped not just by rules, but by desires that were never originally yours. The things you crave, love, validation, success, even rebellion, are largely prescripted, inserted into you by culture, family, media, and institutions. You're taught what to want long before you understand why you want it. You're told what a good life looks like, what kind of love is acceptable, what behaviors are rewarded, and what beliefs will make you belong. These aren't natural instincts, they're social constructs that feel natural because they've been embedded so early and so thoroughly. You mistake them for your own because you never knew anything else. Michel Foucault challenged the idea that society is a repressive force. Instead, he argued, power is productive. It doesn't just say no, it creates the conditions for what you see as normal. It produces language, behavior, and desire itself. You don't resist authority with some pure inner self. You resist within a framework that authority has already designed. Your instincts, in other words, are not a rebellion against society. They are its most subtle products. Even the concept of natural behavior is socially loaded. Gender roles, sexual preferences, career ambitions, all of these are filtered through layers of cultural expectation. A boy who wants to cry is told to man up. A girl who leads is labeled bossy. Their instincts aren't being suppressed. They're being rerouted. They begin to desire the approval that comes from compliance more than the satisfaction of self-expression. And this rerouting becomes so internalized that it feels voluntary. Even your desire to be unique or authentic is manipulated. You are offered consumer choices, lifestyle labels, subcultures, all engineered options for you to pick from and feel like an individual. But this freedom is illusory. You are not escaping the system, you're navigating its maze. Your instincts guide you not to truth, but to manufactured outlets designed to absorb and neutralize dissent. This manipulation is so effective because it operates invisibly. You're not forced to conform, you want to. You discipline yourself. You shame yourself. You censor yourself. You begin to monitor your own desires, aligning them with what society deems acceptable or aspirational. And when you step out of line, the system rarely has to punish you. Your peers, your job, your own internalized values do it for you. The instinct to be loved, to be admired, to succeed, none of these are pure. They are inflected by a system that decides what love, admiration, and success look like. And so your most basic drives may not be your own. They are puppeted from the inside not by a tyrant, but by 1,000 voices speaking through you. Real freedom does not begin by obeying your instincts. It begins by questioning them. Until then, you are not free, you are programmed, not by force, but by design. Happiness is a chemical distraction from the horror of being. What we call happiness is often nothing more than a temporary neurochemical shift, a brief flood of dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin, masking the deeper dread that underlies human consciousness. Beneath the celebrations, the smiles, the daily affirmations, is a truth that most cannot face. Existence is chaotic, indifferent, and riddled with suffering. Life begins in pain and ends in decay. And between these two bookends lies a series of compulsions dressed as dreams. In such a structure, the pursuit of happiness becomes less about meaning and more about sedation. Happiness, in the modern sense, has been commodified. It is sold as a lifestyle, a curated Instagram feed, a vacation in Bali, a scented candle, a new morning routine. These are not pathways to meaning. They are distractions, carefully packaged to keep the mind from wandering into existential terrain. We are taught that if we aren't happy, something is wrong with us. But this itself is the trick. Constant happiness is not a sign of wellness, it's a sign of detachment from reality. Arthur Schopenhauer viewed life as fundamentally painful, driven by the will, a blind, ceaseless striving. In his view, happiness is merely the brief pause between sufferings. We feel pleasure, not as a state in itself, but as the relief from pain. When you eat, you're satisfying hunger. When you win, you're silencing self-doubt. The so-called joy is just the absence of agony, a temporary release. And then the hunger returns. The horror of being lies in our awareness. Unlike animals, we don't merely live, we know we're alive. We observe ourselves, question our value, fear our mortality. This self-awareness, though essential to consciousness, is also a curse. It opens us up to existential dread, the awareness of meaninglessness, the inevitability of death. To survive this realization, we construct rituals, routines, beliefs, and above all, the pursuit of happiness. But happiness, as currently defined, is shallow. It is a fleeting chemical high, mistaken for fulfillment. It's the buzz after a like, the rush of a purchase, the artificial glow after a pep talk. Rarely does it come from confronting reality. And that's because real confrontation doesn't feel good. It strips you bare. It shows you how little control you actually have, how fragile your identity is, how constructed your beliefs are. No dopamine hit can survive that fire. This is why people prefer distraction. Endless work, constant scrolling, new relationships, new goals, anything to avoid sitting still with the sheer absurdity of being. Even meditation, meant to deepen awareness, is often repurposed as a productivity tool, a way to manage stress and feel centered while avoiding the deeper confrontation with the void. The mind, in its biological wisdom, seeks chemical balance. But in doing so, it often suppresses truth. What we call happiness may simply be the brain's way of keeping you from panic, from realizing that the story you've built about yourself, your worth, your place in the world, is fragile. And in this light, happiness becomes less a goal and more a mechanism, a drug the body uses to keep the spirit from collapsing under the weight of awareness. Love is often just ego in disguise, longing to be worshipped. Love is idealized as the highest expression of the human spirit, a transcendence of the self in service of another. But more often than not, love is not about the other at all. It is about the self, about being seen, validated, desired, and adored. What is framed as selfless devotion is frequently a form of possession, a craving to be mirrored and magnified by another. The beloved becomes a vessel for the lover's ego, a stage on which the self performs and is applauded. Ego, by nature, is hungry. It wants recognition, specialness, permanence. And love seems to promise all three. In being loved, we feel chosen, unique in a world of billions. We feel permanent, woven into another's life. We feel secure, because to be loved is to matter. But this dependency on being seen through another's eyes reveals love's dirty secret. Much of it is about self-affirmation, not self-sacrifice. This becomes most apparent when love is not returned or when it fades. The pain is not just loss, it is ego collapse. The person who once validated your worth no longer reflects it. Suddenly, you're alone with yourself again, and the silence is unbearable. So you chase new love, new validation. Not because you're healed, but because the ego cannot survive long without its mirror. Nietzsche warned of the hidden power dynamics in relationships. What appears to be devotion is often disguised will to power. You want to be irreplaceable in someone's life. You want to be the source of their joy, their pain, their transformation. This is not love, this is empire. The heart builds kingdoms, and it crowns itself ruler. Even the idea of falling in love suggests a loss of control, a romantic surrender. But in reality, many people fall because they want to be caught. They crave the intoxication of being someone's world, someone's obsession. It's not about the other person's soul, it's about how they make you feel about your own. Love becomes a narcotic for self-esteem. The ego's involvement in love explains why jealousy exists. If love were truly selfless, there would be no fear in letting your partner experience joy elsewhere. But ego cannot tolerate competition. It demands exclusivity, because it equates love with identity. To lose the other is to lose a part of the self. Love, when contaminated by ego, becomes conditional. I love you as long as you reflect me the way I want to be seen. This is not to say that all love is fake or manipulative, but genuine love is exceedingly rare. It requires ego death. It demands that you see the other not as a mirror, but as a mystery. It requires you to relinquish control, to accept their otherness, their separateness, even their eventual departure. Most are not ready for that. They want devotion, but only if it feeds them. They want intimacy, but only if it secures them. They call it love, but it's often worship of the self, through the other. Power is not earned, it's taken, by any means necessary. The idea that power is earned through merit, fairness, or morality is one of society's most cherished illusions. In reality, power is seized, often ruthlessly, and almost always without waiting for permission. Those who wield power understand that the world does not distribute it evenly or justly. It flows not to the worthy, but to the willing, to those prepared to manipulate, to dominate, to outmaneuver. History is not a chronicle of justice, it's a record of conquest. Every institution, every empire, every system of control began with someone who refused to wait their turn. They didn't follow rules, they made them. They didn't seek approval, they imposed will. Power is never neutral. It is born in imbalance. And to maintain it, one must either expand or defend it relentlessly. Those who believe they can simply deserve power are always at the mercy of those who understand how to take it. Nietzsche recognized the will to power as the fundamental human drive, deeper than survival, deeper than love. It is the urge to impose one's values, one's form, one's meaning onto the chaos of existence. And those who deny this drive do not eliminate it, they merely leave it in the hands of others. To refuse power is to be ruled. To moralize power is to misunderstand it. The myth of earned power is particularly useful to those already in power. It legitimizes their position. It convinces the masses that the powerful got there through virtue, intelligence, or divine right. But behind every throne is a battlefield, literal or metaphorical. Power comes from strategy, not sincerity. from leverage, not love. Even in personal relationships, this principle holds. Influence is rarely about who is right. It's about who can frame the narrative, control the emotions, set the tempo. People mistake likability for leadership, but the one who commands the room is not always the kindest often. They're simply the most ruthless in concealing their intent. To believe that power can be earned is to live in perpetual waiting for recognition, for opportunity, for fairness. But power does not arrive, it is extracted. It is built on decisive action, not passive virtue. It respects no one who waits quietly. It gravitates to those who move first, speak last, and are willing to be feared if they cannot be loved. Power has no inherent morality. It can liberate or enslave. It can build or destroy. But its acquisition has always followed the same laws: audacity, strategy, and the willingness to cross lines others won't. The meek may inherit the earth, but only after the powerful have finished with it. There is no absolute truth, only perspectives reinforced by control. Foucauldian perspective. Michel Foucault dismantled the comfortable Enlightenment belief that truth is something objective, eternal, and waiting to be discovered. For Foucault, truth is not found, it is made. It does not exist outside of human relationships, but is produced within webs of power and discourse. Truth, he argued, is inseparable from the mechanisms that define, authorize, and enforce it. It is not free-floating, it is institutional. What we call truth is a construct born from language, social structures, academic systems, and political necessity. Every era has had its own truths: divine right of kings, geocentrism, racial hierarchies, heteronormativity. These were not just opinions, they were established, taught, and enforced by the church, the state, the university, and the media. They were the truths of their time, and anyone who challenged them was branded a heretic, lunatic, or criminal. Foucault emphasized that truth is bound up with what he called regimes of truth systems that determine what can be said, who can say it, and what counts as legitimate knowledge. Scientists, priests, teachers, doctors, and judges are not neutral arbiters of truth. They are agents of a structure that defines truth in ways that serve dominant interests. Whether it's psychiatric diagnosis, sexual norms, criminal behavior, or medical definitions of gender, truth is often what reinforces the existing order. Consider how truth is handled in modern politics. Two sides present incompatible narratives, both claiming to be rooted in facts, evidence, or morality. Each builds a world of truth sustained by media, institutions, and repetition. The side with greater control over education, law, or information flows ultimately shapes what the public accepts as true. Foucault would argue this is not a breakdown of truth, but its true nature revealed. Control over truth production is power at its most sophisticated. Unlike brute force, which compels the body, truth shapes the soul. If you control what people believe is normal, rational, or factual, you don't need to coerce them, they will regulate themselves. This is the heart of Foucault's idea of biopower, systems that manage life by shaping knowledge, desire, and identity. We believe we are choosing freely, but our choices have already been filtered by what we've been told is real. This doesn't mean all knowledge is equally false, or that nothing matters. Foucault's point is not to deny facts, but to interrogate how facts are produced and used. What questions are allowed to be asked? Who is funded to study them? Which findings are amplified or suppressed? Truth, like money or language, is a social product. It circulates, gains value, and legitimizes action. In this light, truth is a battlefield. Competing powers struggle to define what counts as real. Every book, broadcast, curriculum, or public health policy is a skirmish in the war over reality. Understanding this doesn't make truth worthless, it makes it political. And once you understand that truth is never neutral, you begin to see the world not as it is, but as it is made to be. God is dead, and we killed him out of our mediocrity. Nietzschean perspective. God is dead. This statement, perhaps Nietzsche's most famous, is often misunderstood. He didn't mean it literally. He meant that the belief in Goddess, the moral center, as the giver of meaning, as the source of objective values, no longer held power over Western civilization. And we didn't lose God through war or persecution. We killed him not in a heroic act of rebellion, but in a slow, cowardly erosion of faith, depth, and courage. We let him die out of mediocrity. Nietzsche believed that the death of God was inevitable once science, reason, and secularism became dominant. For centuries, Western thought had rested on the assumption that morality came from a divine source. With that foundation gone, the moral architecture remained standing, but it was hollow. People still spoke of good and evil, right and wrong, but with no transcendent source, these became habits, not truths. But Nietzsche's warning was not about atheism, it was about the consequences. Killing God meant killing absolute meaning, killing objective morality, killing the belief in a universal human purpose. And we were not ready for that freedom. In The Gay Science, he writes of the madman who runs through the town, declaring that God is dead and we have killed him. The madman asks, how will we comfort ourselves? Who will wipe this blood from our hands? The mediocrity Nietzsche refers to is the herd mentality, the modern individual who is content with shallow pleasures, moral conformity, and safe opinions. Instead of seizing the opportunity to create new values, to become the Übermensch, the overman, who shapes meaning from within, we retreated. We clung to decayed moral systems, turned to nationalism, consumerism, or nihilism to fill the void. We killed God, but lacked the courage to live without him. Nietzsche feared the rise of the last man, a creature who avoids suffering, avoids passion, avoids greatness. The last man says, we have invented happiness, and blinks. He wants comfort, not challenge. He is the spiritual consequence of a world without God, mediocre, satisfied, and spiritually empty. This is the true tragedy. God died not in a blaze of rebellious glory, but through boredom and disinterest, through the elevation of safety over risk, sentiment over greatness, and ease over effort. The death of God is not just a loss of theology, it is the loss of transcendence, of striving, of soul. Nietzsche was not cheering the death of God, he was mourning it, but he also saw it as an opportunity. If we cannot rely on a divine source, then the responsibility of meaning-making falls squarely on our shoulders. The question is whether we are strong enough to bear that burden or whether we will collapse into nihilism, forever haunted by the corpse we created. The will to live is the root of all suffering, Schopenhauerian perspective. For Arthur Schopenhauer, the fundamental force behind all life is the will-blind, unconscious, striving energy that permeates everything in existence. Unlike other philosophers who saw will as a virtue or a source of human strength, Schopenhauer viewed it as a curse. The will to live is not noblete, is the origin of every agony we endure. The will is not rational. It is not directed toward higher goals. It simply wants for no reason and to no end. In humans, this manifests as desire. The desire for food, love, status, security, pleasure, even meaning. These desires give rise to actions, ambitions, and relationships. But they never result in lasting satisfaction. The moment a desire is fulfilled, it is replaced by another. We escape pain only briefly, before falling into boredom or renewed longing. This cycle is relentless. To live is to want, and to want is to suffer. Schopenhauer argued that suffering is not an occasional feature of life. It is its foundation. Pain is constant. Pleasure is fleeting. Even joy is usually the absence of suffering rather than a positive state. We chase happiness like a mirage, never realizing that it's the will that keeps us trapped in pursuit. Unlike other thinkers who saw human reason as our saving grace, Schopenhauer believed reason only made things worse. Animals suffer, but they do not understand their suffering. Humans, endowed with self-awareness, suffer more because we can imagine other outcomes, feel regret, anticipate death, and perceive our powerlessness. Consciousness, far from liberating us, deepens the wound. Love, often idealized as a redemptive force, is especially insidious in Schopenhauer's framework. It is a tool of the will to reproduce. You think you're falling in love based on personality or virtue, but beneath that lies the will's biological imperative. You are not choosing freely, you are being used by life's machinery to create more life, and therefore more suffering. Even heroic efforts achieving great success, producing art, or founding families are not exempt. They are simply higher expressions of the will, still bound by it. Every act of striving is still ensnared in the endless chain of wanting and lacking. Greatness does not escape, the will it intensifies it. So what is the way out? Schopenhauer's answer lies in denial not of life, but of the will. Through asceticism, meditation, deep aesthetic experience, and compassion for others' suffering, one can achieve a degree of detachment. The saints, monks, and mystics are not foolish, they are enlightened. They see the trap and choose silence, renunciation, and stillness. But these are rare paths. Most people will never break the chain. They will suffer, breed, and die caught in the gears of the will that birthed them. Schopenhauer offers no shallow hope. His philosophy is a mirror held up to the human condition, and in that mirror we see the raw truth. We are not noble beings fallen from grace. We are creatures of hunger, led blindly by a force that does not care. Religion is the art of dressing fear in sacred robes. At its core, religion is not simply a system of worship or morality, it is a psychological scaffold built to make the unbearable feel noble. It takes the raw terror of human existence, death, meaninglessness, chaos, suffering, and wraps it in a language of divinity. It tells you that the unknown is not just mysterious, but intentional. That suffering isn't just random, but redemptive. That death is not the end, but the doorway. These reassurances are not rooted in truth, but in need, the desperate need for order in a universe that offers none. Fear is the seed from which most religious doctrines grow. The fear of death, most obviously, is transformed into hope for an afterlife. The fear of isolation becomes communion with a divine presence. The fear of moral ambiguity becomes a rigid code of right and wrong. Religion answers the unanswerable with certainty, and cloaks uncertainty with ritual. But behind the sacred text, behind the chants and icons and sermons, is a primal need to believe that someone, somewhere, is in control. This control, or the illusion of it, is what gives religion its seductive power. In a world where earthquakes swallow cities, where diseases strike without warning, where loved ones die with no justice or explanation, religion steps in as the great narrative maker. It creates a story where none exists. And even if the story is painful or demanding, it is better than silence, better than the void. But this dressing up of fear is not benign. By claiming to hold the ultimate truth, religion often silences questioning, shames doubt, and punishes deviation. The fear that gave birth to religion also becomes embedded within it fear of sin, of judgment, of damnation. So while religion may claim to free the soul, it often binds it tighter not in chains of iron, but of inherited belief. You are told what to think, what to fear, who to love, and who to kill all under the banner of divine instruction. Even morality under religion is often a form of control, not compassion. You are not taught to be good for its own sake, but to avoid punishment or gain reward. The carrot and the stick are eternal. Heaven or hell, salvation or suffering. These constructs are not born of truth, but of the same mechanism that parents use with children, be good or else. And yet, when wrapped in sacred robes, they are rarely questioned. Friedrich Nietzsche saw through this. He declared God dead not because he hated spirituality, but because he recognized that religion had become a tool of fear and control, a way to keep the herd docile, a way to punish strength, curiosity, and rebellion. Religion, for Nietzsche, was no longer about transcendence, it was about submission. This doesn't mean that spirituality has no value, but institutional religion, when stripped of its mythic language, is revealed as a fear management system, a way to domesticate chaos, a way to give the anxious mind a script. It dresses fear in sacred robes not to conquer it, but to sanctify it. And by doing so, it ensures that the fear never dies, only kneels. Your values? They were installed in you by dead men. The beliefs you hold most sacred, the things you call right and wrong, good and evil, noble or shameful, are rarely your own. They were passed down, absorbed, inherited. Your values were shaped by systems, institutions, and ancestors you've never met and would likely never agree with. Yet they live in you, they speak through you, and you call them mine without question. You were born into a world already narrativized. Long before you could speak, stories were being whispered to you through language, tone, and behavior. What makes a man? What makes a woman? What is success? What is failure? Who is us? Who is them? These are not truths, they are legacies, and the architects of these legacies are often long gone. The moral codes you cling to, the national identity you boast about, the religious or philosophical frameworks you repeat, they are echoes. They come from thinkers, conquerors, priests, revolutionaries, all of them products of their own time, their own biases, their own agendas. And yet, these dead men continue to shape your instincts. When you feel guilt or pride or shame, it is often not your soul speaking, it is a script written generations ago. Take gender roles. Much of what people believe about masculinity or femininity comes not from nature, but from centuries-old traditions created in agricultural societies, religious institutions, and patriarchal hierarchies. These roles were functional, often oppressive, and rooted in survival, not truth. Yet today, people still live inside these roles, defending them as natural, without ever questioning their source. Or consider patriotism. National pride is often instilled through anthem, flag, and story, all written by victors, myth-makers, and state-sponsored historians. You are taught who the heroes are, who the enemies were, and what your place in that narrative should be. These stories are not fact, they are strategy. They are designed to bind a population to a collective identity, and that identity was designed by men who are now bones in the ground. Even your spiritual beliefs may be inherited from thinkers who interpreted symbols and myths through the lens of their own fears and desires. The rules they set about love, sex, power, purity were often designed to control others, not liberate them. And yet, their words become sacred, beyond question, beyond evolution. To realize that your values are not uniquely yours is deeply unsettling. It means you have to re-examine everything. It means you might have to tear out the foundation of your moral identity and decide, consciously, what to rebuild. Most people will not do this. It's easier to live as a vessel than to start from scratch. But those who do dare to look behind the curtain often discover that their deepest beliefs were never examined, only inherited. You were not born with values. You were programmed, and the programmers are dead. The question is, will you let their voices continue to rule your life, or will you start writing your own code? Enlightenment is realizing how little control you actually have. The quest for enlightenment is often framed as a journey toward mastery over thought, over emotion, over reality itself. But the deeper you go, the more that illusion unravels. Enlightenment isn't about gaining control. It's about realizing how little of it you ever truly possessed. It's the moment when the scaffolding of ego collapses, and you see that your thoughts are not yours, your feelings are not stable, and your will is not absolute. You didn't choose your biology, you didn't choose your culture, your early environment, your traumas, or even your deepest desires. You are, in many ways, a vessel filled, shaped, and animated by forces far beyond your conscious awareness. What you take credit for your successes, your insights, your choices are often the result of conditioning, accidents, instincts, and inherited frameworks. This doesn't mean you are powerless, but it does mean that your power is not what you thought it was. Most of what you do is reactive, habitual, and unconsciously patterned. You are a storm pretending to be a sailor. You narrate your life as if you're steering the ship, but the winds of biology, history, and circumstance blow where they will. Realizing this is not a defeat, it is the beginning of actual awareness. The control you think you have is often post-event rationalization. You feel something, do something, and then your mind constructs a story to explain it. The story gives you the illusion of authorship, but the script was already in motion. Neuroscience confirms this. Your brain initiates decisions milliseconds before you become aware of them. Free will, as popularly understood, is largely an afterthought. And yet this realization is liberating. Because once you stop clinging to the illusion of total control, you stop blaming yourself for every failure, every slip, every intrusive thought. You begin to observe rather than judge. You stop trying to dominate your mind and start learning to understand it. The ego loses its tyrannical grip. You are no longer a ruler trying to manage a chaotic kingdom. You are a witness, learning the terrain. Foucault wrote about how power often works not through violence but through internalized discipline. Enlightenment means seeing that this internal control, the need to manage everything, to be perfect, to be consistent, is itself a prison. You don't break free by mastering control, you break free by surrendering to the complexity of what you are. The final irony is this. By realizing you have little control, you actually gain a new kind of power. The power to respond rather than react. The power to let go rather than cling. The power to act without being enslaved by the need to be certain. Enlightenment is not the crown of the self. It is the quiet collapse of the self's illusion. And in that collapse, something far deeper is revealed. Truth is just a story, repeated by those who won the war. Truth is often imagined as an objective constant, something solid, fixed, and discoverable by reason or observation. But what we call truth is more often the narrative crafted by the victors. History, morality, justice, all of these so-called truths are written by those with the power to silence competing voices. The losers are not only defeated militarily or politically, they are erased from memory, or worse, recast as villains in the new order's official story. The textbooks you read, the laws you follow, the heroes you celebrate, they are the results of narrative control. After every war, revolution, or ideological shift, there comes a period of reconstruction not just of buildings and systems, but of meaning itself. And in that reconstruction, the side that won defines what counts as truth. They enshrine their values, justify their actions, and demonize opposition. Once embedded in institutions, these stories are passed down as facts. Michel Foucault understood this intimately. He argued that power and knowledge are not separate, they are mutually reinforcing. Those in power decide what counts as knowledge, and that knowledge, in turn, sustains their power. Scientific facts, historical accounts, medical diagnoses, moral codes, all are shaped by cultural, political, and economic forces. Truth is not discovered, it is constructed. This becomes even more apparent when you look at how truth evolves. What was once heresy becomes doctrine. What was once criminal becomes protected. Slavery was once legal truth. Colonial conquest was moral truth. Women's inferiority was scientific truth. Each of these truths was legitimized by institutions and enforced by power structures. And when those powers fell or evolved, new truths emerged to replace them, equally constructed, equally strategic. Even in modern democracies, truth is not neutral. It is curated through media, filtered through education, spun by PR machines, and amplified or suppressed by algorithms. Public memory is edited in real time. What counts as news, what counts as crime, what counts as progress, these are not decisions made in a vacuum. They are choices, shaped by interest, ideology, and control of information channels. To question truth is to question legitimacy, which is why those in power react so strongly to dissent. If you challenge their narrative, you're not just disagreeing, you're destabilizing the foundation they stand on. That's why whistleblowers are criminalized, dissidents are silenced, and historical revisionism is often met with outrage. The truth, once installed, becomes sacred. Not because it is infallible, but because it is useful. This doesn't mean there is no such thing as reality, but our access to it is always mediated through language, culture, and context. And those filters are designed. When someone tells you the truth, always ask, whose truth? Who benefits from it? Who disappears because of it? The truth, as we know it, is not an impartial mirror. It is a canvas painted by those who survived, prevailed, and wrote the ending. And that ending, once repeated enough times, becomes gospel. The strong do not apologize for their will. In a world governed by compromise, politeness, and consensus, strength has been rebranded as arrogance. But those who possess real power, not positional authority, but inner strength and clarity of will, do not dilute themselves to make others comfortable. They do not seek approval for their ambitions or apologize for their intensity. The strong understand that their will is not a flaw to be hidden, it is the engine of creation. Apology, in this context, is often a ritual of submission. It is a way to signal compliance, to soften impact, to preempt judgment. But those who are truly strong do not need to shrink themselves to fit into someone else's comfort zone. Their will is an extension of their identity, not something to be negotiated, but something to be expressed fully, even if it disturbs the peace. Nietzsche's concept of the will to power is not about domination over others, it's about self-overcoming. It's the force that compels the individual to rise above mediocrity, to break from the herd, to assert a vision without needing external validation. The strong operate from this will. They create. They disrupt. They refuse to apologize for existing loudly. Apologizing for one's will is a form of internalized shame. It comes from a world that teaches people to be small, to be agreeable, to be digestible. Children are taught not to be too much. Leaders are taught to avoid appearing intimidating. Visionaries are told to be realistic. These are all ways of trimming the edges off human potential, dulling the very force that drives transformation. The strong are often feared because they don't seek consensus. They don't dilute their words with qualifiers. They speak directly. They act decisively. And they accept that not everyone will like them. That's not a weakness, that's clarity. In a culture obsessed with people-pleasing, clarity is seen as cold, but it is actually a form of respect both for oneself and for others. The strong don't manipulate. They don't hide behind fake modesty. They show up in full force. Of course, strength must not become tyranny. The will that refuses to apologize must also be disciplined. It must be guided by values, by awareness, by a sense of responsibility. But discipline is not apology. Responsibility is not submission. The strong do not abandon their will to be liked. They shape it, refine it, and let it burn brightly. The need to apologize for one's will comes from a world that has forgotten how to revere power. We are taught to be soft, to blend in, to seek permission. But no masterpiece was made by someone who waited to be understood. No revolution was started by someone who asked nicely. The strong do not apologize for their will because they understand that the world only moves when someone refuses to wait. Every virtue is a vice in disguise. What society calls virtue is often a strategic rebranding of vice. Traits like humility, patience, generosity, and loyalty are praised as moral ideals, but they can just as easily become tools for manipulation, self-deception, and control. The line between virtue and vice is not fixed. It is contextual, fluid, and often a matter of perspective. A virtue held too tightly becomes rigid. A virtue performed for show becomes vanity. A virtue weaponized becomes oppression. Take humility. On the surface, it is the antidote to arrogance. But humility can also be a mask for cowardice, a way to avoid claiming space, making bold moves, or owning one's power. People often pretend to be humble not out of sincerity, but because they fear backlash or rejection. In this case, humility isn't moral, it's strategic invisibility. It keeps you safe, not honest. Generosity, another celebrated virtue, can be laced with control. A gift can be a trap. An act of kindness can create obligation. People give not only to help, but to gain status, loyalty, or leverage. Philanthropy, when tied to ego or PR, is not generosity, it's marketing. The same action, when scrutinized, reveals its underlying motives. What is called virtue may actually be an investment in power. Loyalty is even more dangerous. While it is praised as noble, loyalty can also be a form of moral surrender, a refusal to question, to evolve, or to leave harmful systems. Blind loyalty fuels cults, authoritarian regimes, and toxic relationships. People stay loyal not because it's right, but because it's easier than facing the fear of isolation or betrayal. In these cases, loyalty becomes vice disguised as virtue, a tool to preserve comfort at the cost of truth. Even patience, a virtue of restraint, can mask passivity. Some people are not patient, they are afraid to act. They wait, delay, endure, not because it's wise, but because it's familiar. Patience can become procrastination dressed in moral clothing. It tells you to keep enduring what should have been ended long ago. Virtues are often promoted not to elevate individuals, but to tame them. Be humble, be loyal, be generous. Why? Because these behaviors make you easier to manage. Institutions, families, and societies have a vested interest in shaping behavior through moral labels. The more you internalize these labels, the less likely you are to question the system. Virtue, then, becomes a leash soft, subtle, but just as binding as fear. Foucault would argue that virtue is a mechanism of normalization. It defines acceptable behavior, polices identity, and produces good citizens. But goodbye, whose standard? Virtue, in this view, is not a universal truth, it's a social contract, written by those in power, to maintain that power. This doesn't mean virtue is useless, but to be truly virtuous, you must interrogate it. Ask where it comes from, who benefits, and whether it still serves you. Every virtue, if unexamined, will harden into vice. Not because you are immoral, but because all masks, worn too long, eventually fuse with the face. No one seeks truth. They seek validation. The pursuit of truth is romanticized, painted as the ultimate intellectual virtue, the sacred duty of philosophers, scientists, and everyday seekers. But in reality, most people do not seek the truth. They seek confirmation. What they want is not to discover what is, but to strengthen what they already believe. The process is rarely one of open-minded inquiry. It is a selective search for reinforcement. People do not want to be transformed by truth, they want to be reassured by it. This is especially evident in the way people consume information. They read articles that affirm their political views, listen to experts who reflect their values, and surround themselves with people who echo their conclusions. When confronted with data that contradicts their beliefs, they reject the source, question the motive, or interpret the information in a way that still supports their original stance. This isn't a glitch, it's a defense mechanism. The ego is not designed to be dismantled, it is designed to be preserved. Cognitive dissonance theory explains this well. When people encounter evidence that challenges their self-image or worldview, they experience psychological discomfort. To resolve it, they don't usually alter their beliefs, they alter the interpretation of the evidence. The mind prefers coherence over accuracy. It would rather protect the narrative than face the painful process of revision. Even in spiritual or philosophical circles, where seekers claim to desire enlightenment or deep insight, the same dynamic plays out. Truth is welcome only as long as it flatters or aligns with the desired self-image. The moment it challenges identity, threatens certainty, or demands humility, it is avoided or rebranded as negativity. This is why gurus, prophets, and philosophers are often adored when they say what people already feel, and crucified when they do not. Validation offers comfort, belonging, and a sense of security. It tells you that you're on the right path, that you're not alone, that your experiences and conclusions are meaningful. But this comfort comes at a cost: stagnation. A mind that is constantly seeking validation is not evolving, it is entrenching. It becomes rigid, defensive, and fragile. It loses the ability to adapt, to absorb new perspectives, or to see itself clearly. Truth, in contrast, is uncomfortable. It dissolves illusions. It forces you to admit error, confront bias, and often to suffer. It may shatter relationships, undermine careers, or demand radical change. That's why truth is so rarely pursued, and when it is, it's often not recognized, because it doesn't feel like triumph. It feels like loss. This is not to say that no one has ever sought truth, but those who do are the exception, not the norm. And even they must constantly wrestle with their own need for validation. The human mind is wired for self-preservation, and truth is a threat to the carefully constructed identity we live within. So when someone says they want the truth, what they usually mean is, "Tell me, I'm right." And when the truth refuses to comply, they discard it not because it's false, but because it failed to applaud. Monogamy is a societal bribe to suppress chaos. Monogamy is not merely a romantic ideal, it is a social contract designed to control human behavior and maintain order. It promises emotional security, social legitimacy, and economic stability in exchange for the containment of sexual and emotional chaos. At first glance, this seems noble. But peel back the layers, and monogamy begins to look less like a moral choice and more like a bribe, a reward system built to suppress natural impulses that threaten the collective structure. The human animal is not, by default, monogamous. Anthropological evidence and evolutionary psychology suggest that our ancestors engaged in fluid mating patterns, with bonds forming and dissolving around survival, reproduction, and alliance. But, as agriculture gave rise to property and inheritance, the need to ensure paternal certainty became paramount. Monogamy was institutionalized, not because it was natural, but because it made civilization manageable. It transformed unpredictable erotic energy into a domestic unit. Monogamy serves the state. It simplifies taxation, inheritance, custody, and control. A stable household with clear lines of responsibility is far easier to govern than a free-form network of lovers and offspring. Religious institutions also benefit. Monogamy aligns with doctrines of purity, sacrifice, and discipline. It channels desire, a force of chaos, into a ritual of social virtue. It converts wild instinct into domesticated routine. But the instinct doesn't die. It is repressed. The desire for novelty, for intimacy outside boundaries, for experiences that don't fit into the monogamous frame, doesn't disappear. It is simply criminalized or moralized. Affairs are condemned not just because they hurt, but because they threaten the lie, the illusion that one person can be everything, always, forever. This repression breeds dysfunction. People cheat, lie, fantasize, or numb themselves. They stay in relationships, not out of love, but fear of shame, legal ruin, or social exile. Monogamy becomes a prison where the door is painted gold. You're told it's virtuous, but it's also the path of least resistance. The bribe is clear. Give up freedom in exchange for safety. Surrender chaos, and you will be rewarded with legitimacy. Even the language around monogamy is revealing. Settling down, locking it in, making it official. These are not words of passion, they are words of security and limitation. Monogamy promises peace, but often at the expense of authenticity. The chaotic truth of human desire is buried beneath ritual and routine. This isn't to say monogamy is inherently bad. For some, it provides a container in which deep love can grow. But the problem lies in pretending it's the only natural or moral option. That illusion pressures people into roles they cannot sustain, leading to quiet misery masked as maturity. Monogamy isn't chosen freely if it's the only accepted choice. And until society is honest about the trade-off that monogamy is less about love and more about order, it will continue to use reward and shame to enforce a system that may not serve the people trapped inside it. Altruism often masks a need for superiority. Altruism, the act of selfless concern for others, is widely praised as one of humanity's highest virtues. But beneath its glossy exterior lies a complex web of motives, many of which are far from pure. Often, altruism is not a rejection of ego, but an extension of it. It becomes a subtle performance, a strategy to assert moral dominance, to feel important, or to maintain a sense of control. The altruist, in this light, is not always a giver. They may also be a taker, seeking validation, gratitude, or superiority. Helping others can easily become a power move. When you position yourself as the helper, you automatically cast the other person as helpless. This dynamic creates hierarchy. The altruist stands above, the recipient below. Even if the act is well-intentioned, the structure implies inequality. And often, that inequality is precisely what fuels the desire to help. It allows the altruist to feel needed, noble, even heroic. In this way, altruism becomes less about easing suffering and more about asserting value. This is especially evident in public acts of generosity. The more visible the help, the more likely it is entangled with ego. Social media philanthropy, corporate charity campaigns, public donations. These are rarely free from self-interest. They create reputational capital. The giver is rewarded with admiration, trust, and a sense of righteousness. They become the good one, the moral anchor in a world of selfishness. Even in private, altruism can be addictive. It gives the helper a sense of purpose. Their identity becomes tied to being the one who sacrifices, who shows up, who saves. But this identity can become suffocating not just for the altruist, but for those around them. Recipients may feel indebted, infantilized, or manipulated. The help comes with invisible strings. Be grateful. Don't challenge me. Remember who rescued you. Nietzsche saw this clearly. He argued that moral behaviors, including altruism, are often rooted in a will to power, not necessarily to dominate others, but to affirm the self. Helping others can be a way to mask resentment, to elevate the self without engaging in overt competition. Look at me, not for what I've achieved, but for what I've given up. This moral posture grants superiority without confrontation. In some cases, altruism can even become coercive. The altruist gives so much that the recipient feels trapped. They can't say no, they can't criticize, they can't leave. Because the debt, though unspoken, is enormous. This dynamic is especially common in families, relationships, and religious settings. The selfless one becomes untouchable, even oppressive, behind a mask of virtue. This isn't to say that all altruism is fake, but it must be questioned. Not every act of help is clean. Not every gift is free. The need to help may reveal more about the helper than the helped. And until we strip altruism of its moral costume, we won't see it for what it sometimes is. A mirror, polished not to reflect others, but to glorify the self. Ethics are convenience, dressed up as principles. What we call ethics is often less about moral clarity and more about social convenience. Principles are touted as universal truths, immutable standards by which all conduct should be judged. But in practice, ethics are fluid, adaptable, and frequently aligned with whatever benefits the person or institution invoking them. They are less a reflection of truth and more a reflection of timing, power, and strategic interest. The language of ethics serves to justify actions that, in another context or under different power structures, might be condemned. Across history, acts of violence, exploitation, and deception have been cloaked in the language of ethical necessity. Colonization was framed as a moral duty to civilize. War has been repeatedly justified as a defense of freedom or peace. Even economic inequality is rationalized by ethical arguments about merit, hard work, or divine favor. These are not timeless principles, they are narratives crafted to align moral judgment with structural advantage. Ethics shift with power. What is ethical in one regime becomes unethical in the next. Societies evolve their values not because of universal awakening, but because of political, technological, or economic pressure. Slavery was once ethically acceptable, defended with philosophy, theology, and law. Today it is abhorred. But that shift did not come from some magical discovery of principle. It came from rebellion, conflict, and the gradual erosion of the status quo. The ethics changed because the costs of holding on to them became too high. Even at the personal level, ethical consistency is rare. People bend their values to accommodate desire, fear, or convenience. A person may preach honesty until the truth threatens their reputation. They may advocate compassion until compassion demands sacrifice. What they call a principle is often a preference stable only when untested. When a principle costs nothing, it's easy to uphold. When it demands real discomfort or risk, it often dissolves into rationalization. This doesn't mean ethics are meaningless, but it does mean they're not absolute. Michel Foucault would argue that ethical systems are tools of social control, ways to internalize discipline, normalize behavior, and reinforce power. Morality is less about right and wrong, and more about creating predictable, governable subjects. What's deemed ethical is often what keeps systems functioning smoothly, not what serves the highest good. In this light, ethical behavior isn't always virtuous. It can be cowardly, performative, or complicit. Following the rules may feel moral, but if the rules themselves are corrupt or outdated, then obedience becomes a kind of laziness, an unwillingness to confront complexity or take responsibility for independent judgment. Real ethics, if they exist, require discomfort. They require contradiction, self-examination, and the courage to stand alone when the crowd is wrong. But most people don't want that. They want the comfort of being morally approved, the ease of fitting in, the illusion of righteousness without the burden of truth. So they adopt the ethics of their culture, their religion, their time not because they are correct, but because they are convenient. And they wear those ethics like armor, defending themselves not against evil, but against the terror of ambiguity. To be remembered, you must be dangerous. History does not immortalize the agreeable, the polite, or the well-behaved. It remembers those who posed a threat to systems, to norms, to comfort. To be remembered, you must disturb. You must become a point of tension in the cultural fabric, a force that cannot be ignored or dismissed. Legacy is not granted to the compliant. It is wrested by those who dare to challenge what others accept. Dangerous people, not in the sense of violence, but in the sense of disruption, carve their names into time. They introduce ideas that unsettle. They act in ways that provoke fear, admiration, or outrage. Their presence demands a response. Whether they are loved or hated, they are never invisible. And that visibility, however contentious, is what endures. Friedrich Nietzsche understood this intimately. The Übermensch, his vision of the higher human, is not one who conforms, but one who creates new values. Such creation is inherently dangerous because it threatens the old order. It reveals the contingency of established norms. The dangerous person exposes the lie that the world must be the way it is. And in doing so, they become unforgettable. Society claims to value virtue, but it is fascinated by danger. The people we idolize, revolutionaries, artists, leaders, often defied the rules. They were punished in their time but sanctified after. Jesus, Gandhi, Malcolm X, Socrates, all were seen as threats before they became icons. Their power came not from fitting in, but from refusing to. Even in art, danger is what separates the enduring from the forgettable. Safe work is consumed and discarded. Dangerous work sparks resistance, debate, and imitation. It burns into the collective memory because it refuses to be comfortable. It dares to offend, to provoke, to redefine. To be dangerous is not to be reckless, it is to be willing to cross boundaries others are afraid to approach. It means speaking truths that destabilize, making choices that defy expectation, embodying values that contradict the dominant narrative. It means being prepared to lose approval in order to maintain authenticity. Dangerous people are often isolated, misunderstood, or vilified, but they do not fade. They leave marks, not scratches, but deep carvings in the psyche of civilization. Their names become shorthand for shifts in consciousness. They are the catalysts, the lightning rods, the ones who ignite change through sheer presence. And yet, many people spend their lives trying not to be dangerous. They seek acceptance, softness, and neutrality. But in doing so, they ensure their anonymity. They pass through life without disruption, and as a result, without memory. To be remembered, you must be dangerous. Not because danger is admirable, but because it is unforgettable. The world forgets the compliant. It cannot forget the ones who made it tremble even for a moment. Most people live lives of quiet servitude to dead ideals. People imagine themselves to be free, self-directing individuals, agents of their own destiny. But most live in invisible chains. Not physical ones, but ideological. They serve ideas that were constructed long ago, by people who are no longer alive, yet whose influence remains embedded in every institution, every law, every unspoken rule. These ideas persist not because they are true, but because they are old, and old ideas, when left unchallenged, become sacred. These dead ideals manifest in how we define success, morality, gender, nationhood, work, and even love. The ideal of the nuclear family, the Protestant work ethic, the heroic myth of the self-made man, these were forged in centuries past, often by elites, theologians, or war-hardened philosophers. But instead of questioning them, people adopt them without resistance, internalizing them so deeply that they mistake obedience for identity. They pursue careers not because they love the work, but because the job title fits a narrative. They marry not because they've found something transcendent, but because monogamy is still treated as the end goal of adult life. They strive for wealth, not realizing that the desire itself was planted by systems designed to keep them running, not arriving. Michel Foucault would call this subjectification, the process by which individuals become the carriers of social control. People police themselves, enforce norms, shame dissenters, all while believing they're acting freely. The ideals they live by are not neutral, they are embedded with power. And that power lingers like a ghost, a dead hand guiding the living. Even rebellion often occurs within boundaries set by these old ideas. A person may reject capitalism, but still define their worth by productivity. They may denounce traditional religion, but still cling to inherited morality. They may adopt new identities, but use old frameworks to interpret them. This is not liberation, it is recycling. The tragedy is not just that people follow these ideals, it's that they never stop to question whether the ideals are worthy. They serve loyalty, discipline, sacrifice, not because these are always noble, but because they've been mythologized. To doubt them is to risk exile. So instead, people submit quietly, efficiently, and with smiles. The result is a life lived in templates. You follow the script handed to you. You check the boxes, hit the milestones, conform to expectations. You call it meaning, but it's maintenance. You call it legacy, but it's mimicry. And when you die, you pass on the same script, another link in a chain forged by the dead. To live differently is terrifying. It means writing your own code. It means risking loneliness, failure, and being misunderstood. But it also means freedom, not the kind sold in slogans, but the kind that burns through inherited lies and replaces them with chosen truths. Most will never go that far. They will live and die in quiet servitude, never realizing their lives were spent honoring ghosts. Civilization is the prison we politely agree not to see. The myth of civilization is that it liberates us from savagery, from danger, from chaos. But in truth, civilization is a prison with walls so well decorated most don't even realize they're confined. It organizes life through rules, rituals, and roles, disguising control as culture. From birth, every aspect of your being is shaped to fit a structure that predates you. You are assigned a name, a language, a nationality, a belief system not chosen, but imposed. And every attempt to break out is met with resistance not from guards, but from your fellow inmates. The prison of civilization is not built with bars, it's built with norms, with etiquette, with fear of disapproval. You don't need surveillance when the population polices itself. You don't need a warden when people become addicted to their routines. Civilization achieves its control not through violence, but through consensus. We agree to the terms of our confinement. We agree to chase productivity, to worship the weekend, to mistake comfort for meaning. Michel Foucault made it clear, power is not always overt. It operates through discipline, through the soft architecture of space, time, and expectation. Schools are preparation for factories. Factories are preparation for compliance. Even leisure is engineered, scheduled, marketed, and consumed. The calendar becomes your cage. The clock becomes your overseer. The illusion is that civilization offers choice. But these choices are pre-approved. Which job? Which politician? Which streaming service? The freedom you're given is curated, managed, packaged. You can decorate your cell however you like, but the door stays locked. And because everyone else is in a cell too smiling, scrolling, competing, no one calls it imprisonment. They call it adulthood, responsibility, maturity. What's most insidious is how civilization pathologizes those who reject it. The nomad is a drifter. The dropout is lazy. The skeptic is cynical. The free spirit is having a phase. Civilization makes sure that anyone who questions the structure is seen as broken, not the structure itself. And so the prison guards are not just police or politicians, they are neighbors, teachers, co-workers. They mean well. That's what makes it work. Even rebellion is permitted in small doses. A protest, a vote, a controversial tweet. These are pressure valves, designed not to dismantle the system, but to keep it functioning. Real liberation, the kind that asks you to burn the rulebook and live differently, is framed as madness. Because if one person walks out of the prison and thrives, others might follow, and the entire illusion collapses. To see the prison of civilization requires a brutal honesty, the kind most people can't sustain. It means questioning not just society, but yourself, your habits, your desires, your values. How much of you was truly chosen? And how much was inherited from a system designed not to serve you, but to use you? Civilization promises safety, but often what it delivers is sedation. A life of quiet, predictable motions punctuated by mild pleasures and endless distractions. All agreed upon, all encouraged, all reinforced. The gates are open, but most would rather decorate their cell than walk out. Authority does not want your freedom, it wants your consent. The illusion of modern power is that it grants you freedom. You vote, you choose, you express. But real authority is not interested in your freedom, it's interested in your compliance. And the most effective form of control is not one that demands obedience, but one that makes you believe you chose it. Consent becomes the velvet glove around the iron fist. You're not being forced, you're being convinced. You're not being ruled, you're being represented. That's the trick. True authority has evolved past brute force. It no longer needs to beat you into submission. It needs you to submit willingly. It shapes your worldview, limits your options, manufactures your fears, and then offers you a pre-approved set of choices, all within a system it designed. And when you choose from those options, it tells you you're free. Foucault recognized that power operates most effectively, not when it is visible, but when it becomes internal. You begin to regulate your behavior, censor your thoughts, and punish your own dissent. You become a participant in your own domination. That's what authority wants, not resistance to crush, but loyalty to cultivate. It wants you to enforce its rules, not because you have to, but because you believe in them. This is why governments invest more in public relations than public truth. Why corporations sell identity, not just products. Why educational systems teach obedience masked as discipline. The goal is not to suppress you, it's to program you. To make you believe that the system's values are your values. That its goals are your goals. Once that alignment is complete, no chains are necessary. You become the custodian of your own cage. Even rebellion is commodified. You can protest as long as it fits within the narrative. You can critique as long as the critique doesn't undermine the system's foundation. Authority doesn't fear all resistance. It fears resistance that cannot be absorbed. And so it offers you safe outlets. Rage, but not revolution. Speech, but not sabotage. Hashtags, but not heresy. Consent becomes a shield. Whenever authority is questioned, it points to the participation of the masses. Look, they voted. Look, they signed. Look, they agreed. But consent extracted through fear, manipulation, or ignorance is not real consent. It is submission with a smile. The greatest trick of authority is convincing people that their choices are free when they are merely pre-filtered, that their voice matters when it's merely echoing what they've been fed. And the more convinced you are of your freedom, the less likely you are to see the bars. Authority doesn't want to fight you, it wants to be loved by you. Because loyalty is stronger than fear. And consent is the final stage of control. The masses fear freedom more than oppression. Freedom sounds noble in theory, a banner word for revolutions, manifestos, and human rights. But in practice, true freedom terrifies most people. Not the kind of freedom that comes with more shopping choices or better travel options, but the deep, existential kind, the freedom to define yourself without a script, to live without guarantees, to bear the full weight of your choices and their consequences. That freedom doesn't feel like liberation. It feels like chaos. Oppression, in contrast, offers certainty. Rules are clear. Expectations are defined. Life is navigated within a system that provides structure, even if that structure is limiting or cruel. Many prefer the predictability of oppression to the ambiguity of freedom. Oppression is familiar, even comforting. You always know who the enemy is, what role you play, and what's required to survive. This is why so many oppressed populations internalize the rules of their oppressors. Why people defend the systems that hurt them. Why the enslaved may fight to preserve their master's house. Why the worker may defend the boss. Why the citizen may cheer for surveillance in the name of safety. It's not because they're ignorant. It's because true freedom would mean facing the abyss, the terrifying possibility that no one is in control, that safety is not guaranteed, that you are responsible for your own meaning. Freedom demands authorship. You don't get to blame a system, a government, a god. You can no longer hide behind tradition or ideology. You have to build your values, make your decisions, and accept that others may reject or punish you for them. That burden is heavy. And most people, when given the choice, will trade it for comfort, even if that comfort comes with chains. This is why revolutions often replace one form of oppression with another. The people don't want to live in a vacuum of rules, they want a better master, not no master at all. They want safety, not sovereignty. The masses are not driven by a hunger for autonomy. They are driven by a hunger for stability. And freedom, at its core, is unstable. Philosophers like Erich Fromm wrote about this escape from freedom, the psychological impulse to flee from autonomy into authoritarianism, because freedom exposes you. It reveals your ignorance, your fear, your potential. And that exposure is unbearable for those who've never learned to stand on their own. Even in democracies, freedom is constrained. People don't vote for risk, they vote for order. They don't support the radical, they support the familiar. And when crisis strikes, they beg not for liberty, but for protection. The slogan changes from "live free or die" to "make us safe again." Freedom becomes negotiable the moment comfort is threatened. The masses fear freedom not because they are weak, but because they have been trained to be dependent. Independent thought is punished early. Conformity is rewarded. And by the time adulthood arrives, most people are experts in obedience, not exploration. So, when offered freedom, they hesitate, not because it's wrong, but because it demands too much. Better the familiar chains than the unknown open door. Better oppression with order than freedom with responsibility. Art is born not from joy, but from suffering's scream. Art does not bloom in paradise. It erupts from fracture, from tension, from the places where the soul splits under pressure. While joy may inspire decoration or celebration, it rarely provokes creation in its deepest form. Great art, the kind that cuts through time, identity, and language, is not a product of contentment. It is the consequence of pain made articulate, of suffering that refuses to die silently. When life wounds, art is how the wounded scream without words. This isn't romanticism, it's realism. Look at the great works across history, literature, painting, music, film. They are soaked in grief, rage, longing, or despair. Van Gogh painted not because he was healed, but because he was haunted. Sylvia Plath wrote with a pen that dripped not ink, but torment. Frida Kahlo painted her broken body and broken heart onto canvas because the world had become too small to hold her agony. These were not well-adjusted people expressing joy. They were fractured souls, transmuting suffering into beauty. Why does this happen? Because suffering strips away the trivial. When you're in pain, real, existential pain, you are face to face with truth. You are no longer distracted by superficial pleasures or polite conversation. Pain exposes the raw nerve of being. And in that exposure, there is the potential for profound clarity. Art becomes the only language capable of carrying that clarity without destroying the speaker. Joy is fleeting, lightweight. It doesn't demand explanation. You live it and move on. But suffering lingers. It festers. It searches for release. Without expression, it corrodes from within. Art is the alchemy that prevents that corrosion. It turns the unbearable into something bearable, not just for the artist, but for the audience. When we engage with powerful art, we are not simply entertained, we are recognized. We see our own unspoken agony, mirrored, shaped, given form. Art also emerges from the inability to speak directly. Some pain is too complex for linear narrative or rational argument. So it becomes a painting, a melody, a poem. It leaks into metaphors and colors, into broken harmonies and surreal images. The form is indirect because the feeling is too large, too amorphous, too embedded in the bones. And that's why it reaches deeper than logic ever could. Even when artists are not in active pain, the best among them carry memory scars. They create from the place that remembers the childhood trauma, the lost lover, the identity crisis, the existential dread. The studio, the stage, the page, these are not playgrounds for the content. They are battlegrounds for the broken. To reduce art to a product of joy is to misunderstand its function. Joy dances, but pain writes symphonies. Joy smiles, but pain carves statues. Joy skips over the surface of life, but pain plunges into its depths. It is not the sunshine that etches itself into the soul, it is the thunderstorm, and in the silence that follows, art begins to speak. The human being is more animal than angel. Deal with it. Human beings like to imagine themselves as elevated, transcendent, closer to gods than to beasts. We romanticize the soul, moralize the mind, and talk endlessly about free will, compassion, and higher purpose. But strip away the posturing, the rituals, the polite language, and what remains is a creature driven by instinct, fear, pleasure, and survival. The line between man and animal is thinner than we dare to admit. It's not that we aren't capable of higher reasoning, it's that we so rarely operate from it. Our nervous systems are ancient. Our fight-or-flight response hasn't evolved beyond the jungle. We respond to social rejection like it's mortal danger. We hoard resources even when we have more than enough. We crave dominance, territory, sex, and validation. Civilization may have given us clothes, language, and social contracts, but it hasn't rewritten our biological blueprint. We still sniff out power dynamics like wolves. We still cling to tribes. We still lash out when threatened physically or ideologically. Morality itself often functions as a veneer. We justify our desires with ethics, but the desire comes first. We build ideologies around what feels good to us. Altruism gets tainted by ego. Justice is often a mask for vengeance. Even love, that most sacred of human experiences, is rooted in biochemical attachments, designed to ensure mating and protection. We elevate it, but we don't transcend it. Nietzsche saw this clearly. His critique of morality wasn't that humans are evil, it's that we pretend not to be animals, and in doing so, we become dishonest. We create moral systems to hide from our instincts instead of owning them. We talk of peace, but are aroused by violence. We preach humility, but chase status like primates. We write poetry, yes, but often to seduce, to grieve loss, or to immortalize our ego. The danger in denying our animal nature is not just philosophical, it's practical. When we ignore instinct, it doesn't disappear, it festers. It finds covert expressions, passive aggression, self-sabotage, addiction, repression. The parts of ourselves we pretend don't exist become the parts that control us from the shadows. The more angelic we pretend to be, the more dangerous our shadow becomes. Owning our animality doesn't mean surrendering to brutality. It means acknowledging the raw material we're made of. It means accepting that we are wired for contradiction, capable of nobility, but prone to pettiness. We are not blank slates or fallen angels. We are apex predators trying to write poems with blood on our hands. To deal with this truth is to become honest, grounded, aware. It's to stop pretending and start integrating. You cannot become whole by denying half of yourself. You cannot become wise by pretending you were never wild. Humanity doesn't come from rejecting the animal, it comes from confronting it, embracing it, and choosing what to do with its fire. Most of your beliefs were injected, not chosen. You like to think your beliefs are yours, shaped by reason, chosen freely, grounded in truth. But most of them were installed long before you had the capacity to question them. You inherited them from your family, your culture, your religion, your nation, your media. They were whispered to you in bedtime stories, etched into your school curriculum, embedded in the jokes you laughed at and the rules you followed. You didn't choose them, they were injected. From birth, you were surrounded by signals. What's good, what's bad, what's beautiful, what's shameful. These were not up for discussion, they were implicit in every reward and every punishment. When you obeyed, you were praised. When you deviated, you were corrected. The programming began not with information, but with emotional conditioning. You learned what to believe by learning what to fear. As you grew, your environment offered you identities: student, citizen, believer, rebel. Each came with a script. Even your rebellion was anticipated. The system doesn't fear deviation, it designs alternatives. The punk, the activist, the contrarian, all can be folded back into the narrative, sold their own brand of conformity. Beliefs become fashion statements, and ideology becomes a playlist. Michel Foucault described this dynamic as the internalization of power. You don't need to be forced into belief, you will enforce it on yourself. You'll defend it against outsiders. You'll seek out confirmation. You'll interpret new information in ways that support the old framework. Not because you're irrational, but because belief is identity. And identity, once formed, protects itself at all costs. Most people don't want to question their beliefs because doing so would mean destabilizing the foundation of their lives. If your political views, your religious convictions, your values, if these were not chosen, what does that say about you? If your most sacred truths are inherited scripts, what happens to your sense of self? It's easier to double down than to deconstruct. But truth does not require belief. It doesn't care about your upbringing, your culture, your tribe. Beliefs, on the other hand, are often built for survival, not accuracy. They give coherence to chaos. They offer belonging. They reduce cognitive dissonance. But that doesn't make them true. It makes them useful. To reclaim your mind, you must be willing to tear it apart. You must trace your beliefs to their source. Ask who taught you this. Ask what they stood to gain. Ask whether you ever had a real choice. Most won't go that far. Not because they can't, but because they don't want to know the answer. It's easier to decorate the house of your inherited beliefs than to demolish it and build your own. But if you never strip it down, you'll never know what's truly yours. Most of your beliefs were injected, not chosen. The question is, will you live by them anyway? Ideals are often weapons disguised as virtues. Ideals are praised as the highest aspirations of the human spirit: justice, equality, liberty, progress. They are carved into monuments, recited in speeches, and used to galvanize movements. But ideals are not innocent. More often than not, they are wielded not to elevate, but to control, not to unify, but to dominate. Behind every shining slogan is a shadow. Behind every ideal is a strategy, a weapon disguised as a virtue. When an ideal is declared universal, it becomes unquestionable. It grants the one who claims it moral authority, and this authority can justify nearly anything. Wars are fought in the name of democracy. Censorship is enforced in the name of safety. Economic domination is rationalized through the lens of modernization. The ideal provides cover. It becomes the mask that hides the interests of the powerful. This isn't just a flaw in the system, it's how the system survives. Ideals operate like Trojan horses. They enter minds wrapped in noble language, but inside, they carry agendas, ideologies, and control mechanisms. The public accepts them because they sound good, they feel right. But their application is rarely pure. The same ideal that liberates one group can be used to suppress another. Take equality. As a principle, it promises fairness. But in practice, it is often deployed to flatten complexity. Differences in culture, perspective, or ability are erased in pursuit of sameness. And when equality becomes a demand rather than a guide, it can lead to forced conformity. Those who deviate even constructively are seen as threats to the ideal. What started as virtue becomes a tool for suppression. Or consider freedom. It's one of the most cherished ideals, yet it's used to justify everything from deregulation to imperial conquest. Freedom is so broad that it can be applied to nearly any cause. Want to dismantle public welfare? Frame it as economic freedom. Want to invade a country? Frame it as liberating the oppressed. The word becomes a weapon, and its victims are told they should feel grateful. Michel Foucault warned that power often masks itself in morality. By embedding ideals in institutions, power hides its coercion beneath the surface of consensus. Schools don't just educate, they normalize. Media doesn't just inform, it indoctrinates. Ideals are the software that runs silently in the background, shaping thought, desire, and behavior without needing to shout. Even personal ideals, the ones we hold about ourselves, can become tools of self-oppression. The ideal parent, the ideal partner, the ideal citizen. We punish ourselves for not measuring up, even when the standards are arbitrary or impossible. The ideal becomes a tyrant living in the mind, whispering failure with every breath. This is not a call to abandon ideals, but to interrogate them. Who defined them? Who benefits from them? What happens when they are enforced without question? If you do not ask these things, you risk becoming both the wielder and the target of a very quiet weapon, one that kills not with force, but with righteousness. Forgiveness is sometimes just laziness in disguise. Forgiveness is widely regarded as the pinnacle of emotional maturity, the sign of healing, compassion, and moral superiority. But not all forgiveness is created equal. Often, forgiveness is not a product of wisdom but a shortcut. It becomes a way to avoid the hard work of confrontation, accountability, and emotional processing. In these cases, forgiveness isn't healing, it's evasion. It's laziness in disguise. True forgiveness requires facing the full weight of harm. It demands honesty with yourself and with the other person. It asks you to confront the discomfort, the betrayal, the raw wound. That process is brutal. It takes time, energy, reflection. It may involve grief, rage, and the collapse of illusions. But many people skip all that. They forgive quickly, prematurely, because it feels easier than holding space for pain. Quick forgiveness is often rewarded socially. You're seen as noble, enlightened, evolved. You avoid conflict. You keep the peace. But peace bought at the expense of truth is a counterfeit. It allows the harm to go unnamed and the perpetrator to remain unchanged. The forgiver gets to feel virtuous, and the offender gets a clean slate without ever having to earn it. There's also a darker motivation: control. By forgiving, especially publicly, a person can reclaim the moral high ground. They can assert superiority while masking it as mercy. "I forgive you" can be a form of condescension. It's not reconciliation, it's a performance. It says, "I am better than your failure," without ever addressing the deeper dynamics at play. In many cultures and religions, forgiveness is weaponized. Victims are told to forgive to be free, to be holy, to move on. But this places the burden of resolution on the one who was hurt. It demands labor from the wounded while asking little from the wounder. It protects the system, the family, the church, the institution by silencing pain under the banner of grace. Even internally, people forgive because they don't want to sit with anger. Anger is uncomfortable. It's exhausting. But it's also informative. It tells you where your boundaries were violated. When forgiveness is used to silence that anger too soon, it can be self-gaslighting. It turns injury into guilt. Instead of asking, "Why did this happen to me?" the question becomes, "Why can't I just let it go?" Laziness in forgiveness isn't always conscious. It often comes from fear of conflict, of being alone, of facing the depth of damage done. But avoiding those fears doesn't heal them. It buries them. And what's buried doesn't disappear, it festers. Real forgiveness is not a shortcut. It's a long, grueling path. It doesn't excuse, it doesn't forget. It integrates. Anything less may be convenient. It may look pretty. It may earn applause. But beneath the surface, it is avoidance wearing a halo, and truth, once again, becomes the casualty. Reality does not owe you comfort or coherence. The human mind craves structure. It wants narratives, patterns, causes, and effects. It wants to believe that things make sense, that life is fair, that actions have proportionate consequences, that virtue is rewarded and cruelty punished. But reality doesn't care about your craving. It doesn't provide meaning. It doesn't arrange itself to make your story satisfying. Reality exists independently of your comfort, and it often looks like chaos. Things happen that shouldn't. Good people suffer. Evil thrives. Innocence is crushed. The most brilliant die young. The most corrupt live long enough to collect accolades. There's no balance sheet keeping score. There's no cosmic editor ensuring the story arcs resolve neatly. And the more you expect life to be coherent, the more betrayed you will feel by its absurdity. This is the existential wound, the realization that there is no grand design that bends toward justice. You are not owed clarity. You are not owed closure. The universe is not a narrative. It is a collision of forces: entropy, biology, time, chance. Your tragedies do not make you special. Your success does not prove anything. Both are byproducts of countless variables, many of which you will never understand. Yet people continue to construct beliefs that soften the blow. Religion offers cosmic justice. Spirituality offers karmic logic. New Age thinking promises manifestation. But these are comfort devices, not descriptions of reality. They dress up the unpredictable in robes of predictability. They turn the uncaring into the caring, the random into the destined. And while they may soothe, they also deceive. Even in science, we cling to coherence. But quantum mechanics laughs at logic. Chaos theory dismantles cause and effect. The closer you look, the less stable everything becomes. What we think of as solid is mostly empty space. What we think of as time may not be linear. Reality, at its core, defies the human need for simplicity. This doesn't mean that comfort or meaning are impossible. It means they must be made, not found. You construct coherence from the rubble. You build meaning knowing it is fragile, local, temporary. That's courage not in believing things will make sense, but in living well even when they don't. Friedrich Nietzsche understood this deeply. His concept of amor fati, the love of one's fate, wasn't about resignation, but about affirmation. To love reality not because it is good or fair or understandable, but because it is. To live without the demand that life be anything other than what it is: brutal, beautiful, indifferent. To mature is to let go of the expectation that reality will align with your hopes. It means accepting that coherence is a luxury, not a guarantee, that comfort is fleeting and not a right. And in that acceptance, paradoxically, there is peace. Not because the world makes sense, but because you no longer need it to. The ego only dies kicking and screaming. The ego, that tightly woven bundle of self-importance, identity, and illusion, does not let go quietly. It does not surrender with grace. It clings, resists, bargains, and screams, because its survival depends on remaining at the center of the psyche. The ego believes it is you, that without it, there is nothing. And so when confronted with its own irrelevance or illusion, it behaves like a cornered animal, vicious, cunning, and desperate. You cannot reason with the ego. It will weaponize logic. You cannot humble it gently. It will perform humility, just to keep itself alive, modest on the surface, but prideful beneath. Even spiritual practices, designed to loosen the ego's grip, are quickly hijacked by it. "Look how enlightened I've become," it whispers. "See how humble I am." The ego wants to be the hero of its own death. It wants to survive the funeral. The process of ego death, whether triggered by crisis, loss, psychedelics, or spiritual awakening, is violent, not externally, but internally. It feels like annihilation. That's because the ego has merged with the survival instinct. When it begins to dissolve, the body reacts as if it's dying. Anxiety spikes. Identity fractures. Everything feels unstable. And in that chaos, the ego fights harder. It drags in memories, attachments, opinions, anything it can use to rebuild the illusion of self. This resistance is why most people only experience partial ego death. They get a glimpse beyond the veil but recoil. The pain of letting go is too great. The uncertainty is unbearable. So they reconstruct. Maybe with new beliefs, maybe with a different aesthetic. But the core mechanism remains. The ego reborn, subtler this time, but still in charge. The ego thrives on narrative. I am this kind of person. I've had these experiences. I believe these things. When those narratives collapse, what's left is silence, and that silence is terrifying. There is no story to tell, no role to play. Just presence. Just being. But for the ego, being is not enough. It needs to be someone. It needs applause, conflict, mission. So when stripped of identity, it doesn't die, it howls. Ego death is not a single event, it's a cycle. You dissolve, rebuild, dissolve again. Each time, if you're honest, the structure becomes thinner, more transparent. But the final death, the complete relinquishment, is rare. It requires not just a moment of surrender, but a life lived without clinging. And even then, the ego may return in whispers, slipping through the cracks. It's easy to speak of killing the ego, harder to live without it. The ego provides certainty, continuity, protection. Without it, you must face the unknown, raw, open, vulnerable. That's why the ego fights. It doesn't care about truth. It cares about survival, and its survival often depends on your silence. To truly transcend the ego, you must endure its screams without flinching. You must walk through the fire it throws at you and not run. Because the ego only dies kicking and screaming, and even then, it dies with its eyes open, waiting for a chance to return. Progress is often just rebranded control. We are told that progress is a linear ascent, a steady march toward enlightenment, equity, innovation, and liberty. But what is often labeled as progress is, in practice, a reorganization of control. Power does not disappear in modern systems. It evolves, rebrands, and embeds itself deeper under the guise of improvement. The language changes. The metrics change. But the machinery remains focused on one thing: managing behavior. Progress gives systems the appearance of benevolence. When surveillance becomes digital and seamless, it's not called control, it's called efficiency. When algorithms shape your reality, it's not manipulation, it's personalization. When your autonomy is reduced to a choice between pre-approved options, it's not limitation, it's convenience. The more sophisticated the system, the less obvious the power dynamics. And so control becomes invisible, internalized, even celebrated. Take modern education. Once a tool of religious indoctrination, it now claims to foster critical thinking. But its structure still trains obedience to the clock, to authority, to arbitrary metrics. You learn to sit still, to absorb, to regurgitate. The content may have changed, but the form remains a discipline factory. This is sold as progress, a better, more inclusive system. But its deeper function is unchanged, producing compliant citizens. Or, look at the workplace. Open-plan offices, flexible hours, remote work, all under the banner of progress. Yet the expectation to be constantly reachable, constantly optimizing, constantly available has only intensified. Surveillance has gone digital. Now, your keystrokes are tracked, your productivity measured in real time. You are not freer, you are simply being monitored in a more palatable way. Michel Foucault understood this shift well. He described how power moved from spectacle to subtlety, from kings and executions to institutions and norms. Progress didn't remove power, it decentralized it, made it softer, harder to locate, and therefore harder to resist. What you call autonomy may just be the internalization of external expectations. What you call advancement may simply be a more efficient system of self-management. Even social progress, equality, justice, inclusion often comes wrapped in institutional packaging. DEI initiatives in corporations, for example, frequently function not to redistribute power, but to insulate it. They provide optics, not overhaul. They present the illusion of change while preserving the structure. The marginalized are represented, yes, but within a framework that remains fundamentally unchanged. Control adapts. Progress provides the narrative. This isn't to say progress is always a lie, but it must be examined. Whose interests are being served? What behaviors are being normalized? What freedoms are being quietly traded for convenience, safety, or efficiency? If progress is unquestioned, it becomes ideology. And ideology, no matter how well-intentioned, always conceals a mechanism of control. True progress is disruptive. It doesn't just rebrand the system, it challenges its foundations. Anything less may look like evolution, but it's merely adaptation. A smarter cage, a prettier leash, a smoother lie. Reason is a tool, not a truth. Reason is one of humanity's most celebrated faculties, the engine of science, philosophy, and civilization itself. But it is not an ultimate authority. It is a tool, a method of navigation, not the destination. Reason helps us make sense of the world, but it does not define what the world is. It can construct arguments, but it cannot always capture experience. It can analyze, but it cannot feel. To mistake reason for truth is to mistake the map for the terrain. Every reasoning process begins with assumptions premises that are taken on faith, tradition, or intuition. Change the premises, and the conclusion changes too. Logic is only as sound as its starting point, and those starting points are rarely chosen consciously. They come from culture, upbringing, language factors outside of reason's control. So even the most airtight argument is built on subjective ground. Furthermore, reason is context-dependent. What seems rational in one era becomes absurd in another. Bloodletting was once reasonable. Divine right was once a logical political framework. Even scientific models evolve. Newtonian physics gave way to relativity, which now grapples with quantum theory. Each was built on reason, and each was, in time, redefined. Reason also has limitations. It excels at categorization, measurement, and linear thinking. But not all human experience fits within those boundaries. Emotions, intuition, dreams, spirituality, these can't be reduced to logical structures without losing something essential. Love, for example, does not obey reason. Grief doesn't respond to logic. Meaning itself often emerges from the irrational. Philosophers have long debated this. David Hume warned that reason is the slave of the passions, that our desires move us, and reason merely justifies. Nietzsche went further, arguing that reason is often a defense mechanism, a way to control, suppress, and deny the chaotic impulses that define life. The more we worship reason, the more we attempt to sanitize reality. In modern society, reason has been deified. It's seen as the antidote to ignorance, the savior from chaos. But this is dangerous. When reason becomes ideology, it silences dissenting modes of knowing. It dismisses the poetic, the mystical, the nonlinear as irrational and therefore irrelevant. Yet much of human insight has come from those very places. This doesn't mean we should abandon reason, but we must use it with humility. It is a lens, not the light. It can illuminate paths, but it cannot invent the destination. It is a bridge between the known and the unknown, not a replacement for either. When reason is used wisely, it guides. When it is worshipped blindly, it confines. Truth may include reason, but it is not limited to it. Just as a hammer cannot build a cathedral without hands to wield it, reason cannot reveal meaning without a soul to feel it. Use reason, respect it. But do not mistake it for the whole. It is one voice in the chorus, not the conductor. What is called good is usually just what keeps order. The word good carries a kind of moral authority, a halo that implies universal value, intrinsic righteousness, and timeless wisdom. But when you look closely, what gets called good is rarely about virtue. It's about order, about stability, about preserving the status quo. Societies don't define good to elevate the human spirit. They define it to keep things from falling apart. And what disrupts that order, no matter how just, honest, or necessary, is often labeled bad, dangerous, or evil. Consider how laws operate. Theft, for example, is considered morally wrong. But is it wrong because it violates a cosmic truth? Or is it wrong because it threatens the sanctity of private property, a cornerstone of economic order? Lying is bad unless it's done in the name of national security, diplomacy, or marketing. Violence is evil unless it's performed by the state. The rules of goodness bend toward the interests of power, and the underlying thread is almost always, does it maintain order? Religions codify moral frameworks, often claiming divine origins, but these too are structured for social control. What's good is what reinforces group cohesion, hierarchy, and obedience. Doubt is sin. Heresy is evil. Submission is virtue. These are not universal truths, they're tools. Morality becomes a map, drawn by those who already sit at the center, to ensure that everyone else stays within the borders. Michel Foucault showed how morality is intertwined with institutions. Hospitals, schools, prisons all shape behavior under the guise of ethics. What's considered good behavior is what allows these systems to function smoothly. Discipline is rewarded, deviation punished, not because one is inherently better, but because one is easier to manage. Even in personal relationships, good is often code for predictable. The loyal partner, the obedient child, the supportive friend. These roles are celebrated not just for their emotional value, but because they provide structure. When someone steps outside of that structure, asks too many questions, seeks independence, challenges the dynamic, they are no longer good. they are difficult, problematic, selfish. Again, the moral label serves the order, not the truth. Historically, revolutionary figures were almost always considered evil in their own time. Jesus was a blasphemer. Gandhi was a troublemaker. MLK was called a radical. Their crime wasn't immorality. It was disruption. They broke the order. And only later, when a new order was formed around their ideas, were they retroactively made good. Goodness, in this sense, is posthumous. It's assigned once the chaos has been absorbed and rebranded. What gets called good is usually safe, obedient, manageable. It rewards passivity and punishes disobedience, not for moral reasons, but for logistical ones. Societies don't want truth. They want harmony. They don't reward what is just. They reward what works. And so, morality becomes domesticated. A leash, not a compass. If you want to know what a society fears, look at what it calls evil. If you want to know what it depends on, look at what it calls good. The labels are not moral, they're functional. Order is the true idol, and goodness is just the name we give to whatever helps keep it intact. The desire to help often masks the desire to rule. Helping others is one of the most celebrated human impulses. It paints the helper as compassionate, generous, even noble. But not all help is selfless. Often, the desire to help is not about the other person's needs at all. It's about control. It's about inserting oneself into someone else's story, determining what's right for them, and shaping the outcome in a way that reinforces the helper's own values, identity, or ego. The line between assistance and authority is thinner than we care to admit. The act of helping creates an inherent power dynamic. One person is in the position to give, to guide, to fix. The other is the recipient, passive, dependent, perhaps even broken. This dynamic can feel good to the helper. It provides a sense of purpose, relevance, and superiority. It allows them to define the terms of the exchange, to decide what kind of help is needed and when it's been enough. And in doing so, the helper asserts control subtly, often unconsciously, but undeniably. This is visible in charitable work, where entire communities are shaped around foreign ideals of what progress looks like. The helper brings infrastructure, education, religion, not because they asked what the community truly needed, but because they assumed they already knew. The intention may be benevolent, but the result is cultural dominance. Colonization was justified in exactly this way, as help, saving souls, bringing civilization, teaching morality. Behind every missionary was a ruler. Even in personal relationships, helping can become a form of manipulation. The parent who constantly helps their adult child may be sabotaging their independence. The friend who always offers unsolicited advice may be seeking control, not connection. The partner who sacrifices constantly may be building a moral high ground that becomes impossible to challenge. "Look how much I do for you," becomes the shield and the sword. Helping becomes a problem when it's less about the recipient's empowerment and more about the helper's narrative. If the person being helped begins to grow, challenge, or reject the assistance, the helper may feel betrayed not because the person is worse off, but because they're no longer under influence. The true test of intention is how the helper responds when their role is no longer needed. Foucault spoke of power not just as domination, but as production. Helping can be a way to produce a certain kind of subject, grateful, compliant, morally aligned. The helper becomes the silent architect of another's identity. They shape through suggestion, through boundaries, through subtle expectations. And once you shape someone's reality, you rule it even if you call it kindness. This doesn't mean all help is insidious, but it does mean that help is not automatically virtuous. It must be interrogated. Who benefits? Who controls the narrative? What unspoken expectations are attached? The desire to help can come from love, but when unchecked, it becomes a quiet form of empire. Peace is simply the pause between exploitations. Peace is often mistaken for harmony, a state of resolution, unity, balance. But in many cases, peace is simply the interlude between conflicts. It is not the absence of violence, but the temporary suppression of it. And beneath that surface calm, the systems of exploitation remain intact. Economic inequality, institutional racism, cultural domination, these do not vanish in peace. They retreat, reorganize, evolve. Peace, as celebrated by politicians and historians, is often just a rebranding of strategic silence. When wars end, treaties are signed, and armies disband, it's easy to believe that peace has been achieved. But what really ends is the visible chaos. The violence continues, but in quieter forms. Through economic dependency, media manipulation, systemic neglect. One kind of exploitation is replaced by another less dramatic, more palatable, easier to manage. Colonial powers, for example, no longer send ships and soldiers to extract resources. They now send corporations, trade agreements, and NGOs. The flags have changed, the weapons have evolved, but the dynamic remains, the flow of wealth from the many to the few. This is called peace. It's taught in textbooks as progress. But for the exploited, it's simply a new version of the same suffering. Peace also serves as a tool of delay. When populations rise up against police brutality, environmental destruction, or political oppression, the demand for peace is used to shut them down. Let's be civil. Let's not be divisive. Let's maintain peace. But what's being protected isn't justice, it's the system. The peace that is demanded is not moral. It's managerial. It's meant to preserve order, not to resolve injustice. Foucault's notion of power helps clarify this. Power doesn't always express itself through violence. Often, it works through normalization, through habits, systems, and invisible structures. Peace, in this framework, becomes the moment when power no longer needs to be loud. When the exploited have been conditioned to accept their role, when resistance has been tamed into dialogue, when injustice becomes routine, that's when peace is declared. Even within nations, peace can be misleading. A country without war is not necessarily a peaceful country. If its poor are imprisoned, if its minorities are surveilled, if its workers are disposable, it is not at peace. It is simply in a stable phase of exploitation. The metrics are quiet, but the machine is running. This doesn't mean peace is worthless, but it does mean we must ask, peace for whom? Peace for what purpose? And at what cost? Real peace requires dismantling the systems that make exploitation possible, not just silencing the symptoms. Otherwise, peace becomes a sedative, a pause in the pain, a lull between waves of abuse, dressed up in the language of progress. The world loves peace because it is easy to sell. But beneath the surface, something is always extracting, always consuming, always waiting for the next opportunity. Peace is not the end of exploitation. It's the moment it becomes efficient. The world doesn't reward truth, it rewards power. Truth, by itself, has no currency. It does not guarantee applause, safety, or success. It is, in many cases, a liability. It exposes, disrupts, and threatens. Societies don't thrive on truth. They thrive on order. And truth, in its rawest form, is often disorderly. It doesn't flatter. It doesn't comfort. It doesn't conform. That's why those who speak it are often ignored, exiled, or destroyed, not because they are wrong, but because they are inconvenient. Power, on the other hand, bends the world. It shapes language, institutions, memory. It decides what gets printed, what gets censored, what becomes history. It turns fiction into fact through repetition, enforcement, and ritual. The powerful don't need to be right. They only need to be convincing. And once they control the narrative, their version of truth becomes the only one people recognize. This is not just political. In science, funding determines which hypotheses get explored. In media, corporate interests decide which stories survive. In relationships, the one with emotional leverage often defines the truth of what happened. Even in religion, doctrine is not always derived from sacred revelation. It's shaped by councils, edited texts, institutional agendas. The truth is filtered through 1,000 layers of influence before it ever reaches the public. And by then, it's not truth anymore, it's policy. The philosopher Michel Foucault showed that power and knowledge are not separate forces. They're intertwined. Knowledge is not neutral. It is produced by systems of power and then used to reinforce those systems. What's considered true is often what is useful to the dominant order, and what's labeled false is often what threatens it. The game is not about discovering reality, it's about managing perception. History is full of truth-tellers who were crushed under the weight of power. Socrates was executed, Galileo was silenced, Malcolm X was assassinated. Their crime was not deception, it was honesty. They saw clearly, spoke plainly, and in doing so became threats, because truth destabilizes. It dissolves illusions that support comfort, identity, and hierarchy. And most people would rather preserve those illusions than face what's real. Even today, whistleblowers are hunted, journalists are discredited, thinkers are deplatformed. Not because what they reveal is false, but because it disrupts a carefully maintained equilibrium. The modern world dresses up censorship as safety, propaganda as education, and manipulation as marketing. Power adapts, and truth, if it can't be absorbed, is erased. This doesn't mean truth is powerless. It has a force of its own, corrosive, transformative, enduring. But its power is not in reward. Its power is in destruction of lies, of facades, of systems built on fiction. And that makes it dangerous. The world doesn't reward danger. It resists it. It punishes it. It buries it. So if you choose truth, understand the cost. You will not be applauded. You will not be protected. You will walk alone. But you will see clearly. And in a world addicted to illusion, that is both a curse and a kind of freedom. Success often demands the sacrifice of sincerity. To succeed in any system built on perception, you must learn to perform. Not to be, but to appear. Appear competent. Appear confident. Appear aligned. Sincerity, with all its raw edges and unpredictability, becomes a liability. Because sincerity doesn't always flatter. It doesn't always sell. It doesn't always fit the mold. And so, little by little, it is shaved off, sacrificed on the altar of advancement. The path to success is often paved with small betrayals of the self. You don't say what you really think you say, what's strategic. You don't express how you feel. You express what is acceptable. You don't ask real questions, you stick to the script. This isn't corruption in the dramatic sense, it's erosion. You learn to edit yourself, to brand yourself, to manage impressions rather than embody truth. In corporate life, authenticity is praised but rarely rewarded. You are told to bring your whole self to work, as long as that self doesn't challenge the culture, question the leadership, or express discomfort. The real, you must be digestible, marketable, aligned with the values of the organization, which are often less about integrity and more about profitability. In public life, especially in media or politics, sincerity is even more dangerous. The sincere person says things that haven't been tested in focus groups. They react spontaneously. They admit uncertainty. But the audience, conditioned by decades of branding and media training, interprets this as weakness. And so the successful learn to script their authenticity, to rehearse spontaneity, to master the illusion of sincerity without its risk. Even in relationships, success as defined by social expectations often requires suppression. To keep the peace, to maintain appearances, to avoid discomfort. You smile when you want to scream. You nod when you want to walk away. You become skilled in the art of subtle deception, not because you want to lie, but because honesty has consequences. And success, as defined by the external world, depends on avoiding those consequences. This isn't about being fake in a cartoonish way. It's about navigating a world that punishes rawness, that mistrusts vulnerability, that rewards those who know how to play. The tragedy is not that people become liars, it's that they forget they're lying. The performance becomes the personality. The mask grows skin. Some break away. They lose jobs, fans, status, but they keep their voice. Others keep climbing, but each rung comes at a cost. A piece of truth left behind. A part of self muted. Until eventually, the person who reaches the top can no longer remember who they were at the bottom. Success isn't evil, but it is selective. It prefers polish to passion, consistency to complexity, and above all, it prefers usefulness to truth. So those who rise often do so not by being the most sincere, but by being the most adaptable. The thinker is more alone than the criminal. The criminal breaks laws. The thinker breaks illusions. One challenges the legal system, the other challenges the mental prison. And society, oddly enough, often has more room for the criminal. Criminals are understood, categorized, punished, and forgiven. Their role in the system is clear. But the thinker? The one who asks questions no one wants to answer? The one who speaks truths that cannot be commodified or diluted? That person is isolated, feared, dismissed, or erased. A criminal can be rehabilitated. They can re-enter society once they've been corrected. But the thinker never fully returns. Once you've seen the cracks in the system, the lies in the language, the contradictions in culture, you can't unsee them. You become an outsider, even among friends. You speak, but people hear discomfort. You point, but they look away. Not because they hate you, but because you remind them of what they're avoiding. Even other intellectuals may not offer refuge. Many are thinkers only entitled gatekeepers of accepted narratives, not explorers of dangerous territory. Academia is often a cathedral of conformity, rewarding those who stay within theoretical orthodoxy. True thinkers, those who challenge not just knowledge, but the way knowledge is structured, are rarely celebrated in their time. They are too early, too sharp, too uncompromising. The criminal breaks into systems. The thinker breaks them open. And that's far more threatening. Because systems can absorb crime, it becomes part of their narrative. But they can't absorb someone who refuses the narrative altogether. The thinker doesn't want to be integrated. They want to reveal. And revelation is radioactive. It doesn't just upset order. It exposes its foundations. Nietzsche understood this alienation. So did Kafka. So did Simone Weil. To see the world clearly is to see the loneliness built into clarity. You realize how much of society runs on pretense, moral, political, spiritual, and the more you strip away, the more alone you become. Because most people aren't looking for truth, they're looking for comfort, and the thinker is the one who threatens to take that away. The criminal acts on impulse, the thinker acts on awareness, but awareness comes with a cost. It isolates, it creates distance. You watch people laugh, work, worship, fight, and you see the unconscious patterns beneath it all. The rituals, the masks, the projections. And no matter how much you love them, you can't join them fully, not without pretending. This doesn't mean the thinker is better, only that they are lonelier. Their crime is not harm, but insight, not destruction, but deconstruction. And for that, there is no prison, only exile. Your suffering doesn't make you noble, it just makes you human. There is a dangerous mythology around suffering, that pain elevates, that trauma transforms, that to suffer is to become special, noble, or wise. But pain does not automatically make you anything. It does not grant virtue, depth, or clarity. It simply makes you human, vulnerable, breakable, mortal. Suffering is not a gift, it is a condition. And romanticizing it does nothing but mask its brutality with poetic language. Everyone suffers. Not equally, not in the same way, but universally. Suffering is built into the structure of life: loss, failure, illness, betrayal, grief. These are not detours from the path. They are the path. To be alive is to hurt. The idea that this hurt automatically produces nobility or enlightenment is a projection away to find meaning in the meaningless, to dress wounds in philosophical gold. But pain does not guarantee transformation. Many suffer and become bitter. Many suffer and pass it on. Many break, and nothing beautiful comes from it. The image of the wounded healer, the broken artist, the tortured genius. These are cultural archetypes, not laws of nature. They're comforting because they suggest that suffering is part of a sacred script, a necessary step toward greatness. But the truth is less romantic. Suffering might destroy you. It might make you smaller, more afraid, more cynical. It might do nothing but hollow you out. Arthur Schopenhauer saw suffering as the essence of existence, not its exception. He didn't glorify it. He didn't claim it made people better, only that it made them real. Suffering strips away illusion, yes, but it also strips away joy, trust, and energy. To pretend that every broken thing becomes a lesson is to lie. Some pain teaches, some just leaves scars. What matters is not that you've suffered, but what you do with it. And even that doesn't make you noble, it just makes you responsible. You can use suffering to understand others, to become gentler, wiser, stronger. But you can just as easily use it to justify cruelty, to build walls, to seek revenge. Pain is a tool, not a virtue. It doesn't define you unless you let it. The danger of romanticizing suffering is that it begins to justify itself. People stay in toxic relationships, thinking their endurance is meaningful. People wear their trauma like medals, demanding reverence instead of healing. They build identity around wounds, mistaking pain for personality. But nobility is not measured in scars. It is measured in choices. To suffer is to be human. That's all. It puts you in the same category as everyone else, not on a pedestal above them. It's not a badge of honor, it's a condition of the species. What you build from it is what matters. But never mistake the suffering itself for significance. The fire is not sacred. What you forge in it, that's up to you. History is written in blood, not ink. The pages of history books are white, but their true color is crimson. Behind every celebrated date, every national anthem, every monument, is a story soaked in violence. Civilizations rise on the backs of conquest. Empires expand through slaughter. Borders are drawn with bayonets, not pens. The narrative we're taught of progress, diplomacy, reason is a refined product, sterilized for consumption. But the raw material of history is blood. Wars are the milestones. Revolutions are the punctuation. Massacres are footnotes, if they're mentioned at all. And yet, we speak of history as if it were the result of ideas, as if philosophies, treaties, and ideologies shaped the world in a vacuum. But ideas do not enforce themselves. They need swords. They need guns. They need bodies willing to kill and die. Behind every turning point in history is a trail of corpses forgotten, unnamed, collateral. Even peace is purchased with violence. Armistices come after devastation. Ceasefires are brokered through exhaustion. What we call stability is often the aftermath of destruction, not its absence. The ink that writes treaties is dipped in the memory of bloodshed. Those who hold the pen are often the ones who held the blade. The phrase, "History is written by the victors," captures one dimension, the narrative control of those who survived and won. But more than narrative, they write the morality. Their violence becomes justified, necessary, even noble. The enemy's violence becomes barbarism. Their dead are martyrs. The others' dead are statistics. Memory is curated. Atrocities are renamed as sacrifices. Genocide becomes a conflict. Colonization becomes civilizing. Every drop of blood is rebranded to fit the myth. Michel Foucault showed how power shapes knowledge, and history is a form of knowledge sculpted by power. What gets archived, taught, celebrated, or erased is not neutral. It reflects the interests of those who benefit from the current order. And so, we remember the king's crown, but not the pile of skulls it was built upon. Even resistance movements, when successful, are eventually sanitized. Their messiness, their contradictions, their brutality are smoothed over. The rebels become founders. The militants become freedom fighters. Once they win, they write their version, and the blood they shed becomes a sacred sacrifice, no longer seen as murder. To understand history truthfully, you must unearth what's buried, not just the facts but the flesh, not just the outcomes, but the cost. Every civilization is a graveyard with better architecture. Every flag is a shroud. Every anthem is a lullaby sung over bones. Ink can preserve memory, but blood is what made the memory possible in the first place. Until we reckon with that, we are not remembering history. We are rehearsing propaganda. Most people are slaves who think they are free. Freedom, in modern culture, is a myth so deeply embedded that to question it is seen as heresy. You vote, you consume, you speak, and you believe this means you are free. But true freedom is not about access to choices. It's about understanding where those choices come from, who created them, and whether you had any say in the structure that offers them. Most people never ask these questions. They choose from within a framework they did not design, and they call it autonomy. The slave who thinks he is free is easier to control than the one who knows he is shackled. That's the brilliance of modern systems of power. They don't need chains, they use desires. They don't restrict you through brute force, they shape your preferences, habits, and fears. You're allowed to move freely, but within invisible borders. You can speak your mind, but only if your mind has been shaped to speak what's acceptable. Michel Foucault described this process as the internalization of discipline. You become your own jailer. You monitor your behavior, thoughts, and emotions, not because anyone forces you to, but because you've been conditioned to. Schools teach conformity, not curiosity. Workplaces reward obedience, not innovation. Media saturates you with messages about who to be, what to want, and what to fear. And all the while, you believe you're in control. This illusion of freedom is reinforced through comfort. You're distracted with entertainment, pacified with convenience, and overwhelmed with stimulation. The cage is padded. The walls are decorated. And because it doesn't feel like a prison, you never think to escape. In fact, you'll defend it. You'll mock those who reject it. You'll fight to stay inside, because outside is uncertainty, and true freedom always includes that. Even rebellion is prepackaged. Subcultures are monetized. Protests are permitted in designated zones. Dissent is a brand. Rage is a marketing tool. You think you're resisting, but you're still playing the role the system has scripted for you. Freedom becomes a costume, not a condition. True freedom is terrifying. It requires dismantling everything you've been taught. It demands responsibility without guarantees, identity without validation, meaning without permission. That's why most people reject it. Not consciously, but through every choice they make to stay inside the familiar, the predictable, the approved. To be truly free, you must recognize your slavery. You must question the origins of your beliefs, the motives behind your behaviors, the authenticity of your desires. And that process is painful, because it means realizing that much of your life has been lived on autopilot and that the pilot wasn't you. Most people don't want that realization, so they cling to the myth. They wave their flags, repeat their slogans, and scroll their curated feeds. And they say, "Look how free I am," while the system smiles quietly behind the curtain because the best slaves are the ones who believe they're kings. Identity is a performance, not a truth. Most people believe identity is something they find in essence, a core, a truth that defines who they really are. But identity is not discovered. It is constructed, rehearsed, adapted. It shifts depending on the audience, the setting, the stakes. Identity is a script you perform, not a soul you uncover. It is shaped more by how you want to be seen than by any fixed internal reality. From an early age, we are handed roles: daughter, son, achiever, rebel, believer, outsider. These roles come with expectations. Behaviors are rewarded or punished depending on how well they match the script. The child who gets praise for being quiet may grow into the listener. The one who's scolded for crying may become emotionally numb. Over time, these adaptations become masks so well fitted that we forget we're wearing them. This isn't deception, it's survival. You tailor your identity to fit the social terrain. In school, you might play the diligent student. At work, the team player. With friends, the joker. Alone. Maybe you don't know who you are at all, because there's no one there to play to. This emptiness isn't failure. It's evidence that identity is relational. You exist not as a fixed self, but as a constellation of responses. Irving Goffman, a sociologist, compared life to a stage. We are all actors managing impressions. We dress for the part, speak in the dialect of our group, filter our emotions to stay in character. Even rebellion becomes performance. The punk outfit, the protest chant, the edgy tweet. Authenticity itself becomes stylized. You learn how to be real in ways that still earn approval. Michel Foucault took this further. He argued that identity is not just socially performed, it's produced by power. Institutions shape how we understand ourselves. Schools, prisons, hospitals, and religions don't just sort people, they define what kinds of people can exist. The depressed, the gifted, the criminal, the straight, the female, these are not just labels. They are roles embedded in systems of control, and we perform them, often unconsciously. Social media has only magnified this. You curate your personality like a brand. Your identity becomes content optimized, filtered, and monetized. The algorithm rewards consistency, not complexity. And so you become flatter, simpler, more predictable. The deeper self, if such a thing exists, is buried beneath the persona. This doesn't mean identity is fake. It means it's fluid, constructed, conditional. There may be traits that persist a certain temperament, a recurring pattern. But even those are interpreted through cultural frameworks. What's considered assertive in one society might be rude in another. You don't just perform identity. You perform it within limits set by time, place, and power. To realize identity as a performance is not to lose yourself. It's to gain agency. You stop asking, "Who am I really?" and start asking, "Who am I choosing to be now, and why?" The question is not about finding your true self. It's about taking responsibility for your role on the stage and deciding when and whether to change the script. Power produces reality, not the other way around. We like to believe that reality is objective, that facts shape beliefs, and that systems are built in response to truth. But power doesn't merely reflect reality. It manufactures it. Those who hold power determine what is seen, what is said, what is remembered. They control the frameworks through which people understand the world. And in doing so, they don't just interpret reality, they create it. Michel Foucault made this clear. Power and knowledge are inseparable. What is considered knowledge, whether scientific, historical, medical, or moral, is not simply discovered. It is constructed within systems of power that define what counts as valid. Power decides what research gets funded, what histories are taught, what behaviors are normalized. And over time, these curated versions of reality become common sense. Look at history. Entire civilizations are remembered through the lens of their victors. The conquests are called discoveries. The genocides are called civilizing missions. The resistance is called terrorism. These are not just biases, they are realities manufactured by power. The language becomes the lens, the narrative becomes the truth. In medicine, definitions of health and illness shift with cultural norms. Homosexuality was once a diagnosable disorder. Hysteria was a catch-all diagnosis for female disobedience. These weren't errors in science. They were realities constructed by institutions with authority. Once embedded in policy and practice, they shaped how people saw themselves and how society treated them. Even in economics, reality is molded by those who set the rules. A recession is only a recession when certain metrics say so. Productivity means something very specific in capitalist logic. It rarely includes emotional labor, caregiving, or rest. These definitions shape policy, behavior, and identity. They create a version of reality in which certain values seem natural and others irrational. The media plays a central role in this construction. It selects which events are visible, which voices are amplified, which problems are framed as urgent. By choosing what to show and how to show it, power structures the collective experience of reality. Two people can live in the same world and occupy entirely different realities, not because their perceptions are flawed, but because they are being fed different manufactured truths. Religion, education, entertainment, all work in tandem to build consensus reality. And once that consensus is in place, it is incredibly difficult to challenge. People don't just defend their beliefs, they defend the world those beliefs create. To question the framework is to question sanity, identity, and stability itself. This doesn't mean nothing is real, but it means reality, as experienced, is always filtered through structures of power. Objective facts exist, but what they mean, which ones matter, and how they are acted upon are shaped by those who benefit from their interpretation. So when someone claims they are just telling the truth, ask who benefits from that truth. Ask who defined it, who disseminated it, who profits from its acceptance. Power does not wait for reality to reveal itself. It creates the conditions under which reality is seen and believed. Culture is a weapon used by the dominant to shape the dominated. Culture is often described as the shared expression of a people, their language, art, rituals, and beliefs. But culture is not just organic. It is curated, shaped, and weaponized. It can unify, yes, but it can also dominate. It becomes the soft edge of control, the velvet glove that masks the iron fist. Those in power do not merely conquer with force. They colonize the imagination. They implant values, habits, aesthetics, and norms that align with their interests. And once internalized, this form of domination requires no chains. Michel Foucault warned that power works best when it becomes invisible, when people police themselves without knowing it. Culture is the perfect tool for this. It teaches people how to think, what to want, and what to fear. Through stories, media, tradition, and language, the dominant embed their worldview so deeply that it feels like common sense. Their version of family, success, gender, beauty, and morality becomes normal. Everything else becomes foreign, dangerous, or uncivilized. This is why colonization didn't end with guns and treaties. It continued through education systems, religious missions, television shows, pop music, and fashion. The colonized were not just politically subdued, they were culturally rewritten. Their gods were replaced, their languages suppressed, their dress codes ridiculed. And over time, the colonizers' culture became aspirational. Domination turned into desire. In the modern world, this dynamic hasn't disappeared, it's evolved. Western culture, driven by capitalist interests, exports its values globally through entertainment, tech, and consumer goods. The idea of the modern lifestyle is not neutral. It promotes a very specific way of living: individualism, competition, materialism, digital connectivity, endless productivity. These values aren't universal. They are cultural products with ideological consequences. And yet, because they come wrapped in music, movies, smartphones, and apps, they don't feel imposed. They feel chosen, cool, progressive. But behind the aesthetics is a deeper transformation, the gradual erasure of alternative ways of being. The indigenous worldview, the communal ethic, the slower rhythm, these are marginalized not through laws, but through irrelevance. They are rendered invisible, not by force, but by neglect. Culture also defines legitimacy. What gets published, exhibited, awarded, these decisions shape who gets seen and who doesn't. Artists, thinkers, and leaders outside the dominant cultural narrative must conform or be ignored. This isn't censorship, it's selection, and selection is power. To resist cultural domination is difficult because it often feels like resisting yourself. You like the music. You speak the language. You enjoy the films. That's the trap. You've been invited to participate in your own erasure, and you accepted the invitation with joy. Culture is not neutral. It's a battleground. And those who control it don't need to fight you. They just need you to sing their songs, speak their words, wear their symbols, and call it freedom. Once that happens, the war is already won, and no one even remembers it happened. The greatest control is making people police themselves. There is no need for bars or guards when the prisoner has been taught to keep themselves in line. The most efficient system of control is not one that surveils from above, it's one that implants the mechanisms of surveillance within the individual. Once a person internalizes authority, once they begin to censor their own thoughts, regulate their behavior, and suppress their instincts out of habit, the system no longer needs to enforce. It simply watches its subjects enforce it upon themselves. This is what Michel Foucault called disciplinary power, not the brute force of sovereigns, but the subtle shaping of compliant individuals. Modern institutions, from schools to workplaces to social media platforms, don't operate by coercion. They operate by normalization. They establish what is acceptable, what is desirable, what is shameful, and let people do the rest. You measure yourself against invisible standards. You punish yourself for failing to meet them. You wake up and check your phone not because you are forced to, but because you're trained to crave validation. You manage your online persona because you fear the consequences of deviation. You work harder, stay silent, or shrink yourself because somewhere inside you is a voice not yours, but internalized that whispers, "Be good. Stay in line. Don't stand out." That voice was installed over years of education, culture, media, and feedback loops. And now, it runs without supervision. Social norms are more powerful than laws. You can break a law and still be respected. Break a norm, and you're exiled. People fear judgment more than punishment. They avoid conflict, not out of morality, but out of social survival. The gaze of the group is stronger than the fist of the state, and so the individual becomes both subject and enforcer, inmate and warden. This self-policing extends to thought. You learn not to even think certain things. You pre-filter your opinions before expressing them. You feel guilt for impulses you've never acted on. The moral architecture has been installed in your brain like software, and you run it every day, thinking it's just your conscience when in fact it's conditioning. Even rebellion is often contained. You're given costumes, slogans, safe outlets. You protest within parameters. You're allowed to be angry as long as you don't challenge the fundamental structure. Radical energy gets redirected into aesthetic movements or consumer trends. You feel like you're breaking the rules, but you're still playing the game. The brilliance of this control is that it feels like freedom. You think you're choosing. You think you're moral. You think you're safe. But your autonomy is curated, your identity constructed, and your resistance pre-approved. And all the while, the system sustains itself with minimal effort because you've become your own cage. The greatest control is not when you're being watched. It's when you watch yourself and can no longer tell the difference between your reflection and your ruler. Truth is violent, it destroys what came before. Truth does not arrive politely. It doesn't knock, wait to be invited, and gently ask to be heard. It kicks in the door. It shatters illusions. It levels the comfortable lies you've built your life around. When truth comes, it does not preserve. It breaks. It clears space by tearing down what once stood with certainty. And that is why it is feared. People speak of wanting the truth in politics, in relationships, in their own minds. But what they really want is a version of truth that fits their existing framework. They want clarity without upheaval, insight without sacrifice. But real truth rarely grants that. It is not additive. It's subtractive. It doesn't build, not at first. It burns. Every time truth emerges, it destroys a myth. The myth of your country's virtue. The myth of your partner's love. The myth of your own innocence. These aren't just ideas, they're foundations. When they fall, your identity, your belonging, your narrative collapses with them. That's the violence of truth. It doesn't just inform, it dismantles. Look at history. When Galileo said the Earth revolves around the Sun, it wasn't just an astronomical correction, it was an existential rupture. It dethroned humanity from the center of the cosmos. When Darwin presented evolution, he didn't just update biology, he shattered the sacred idea that humans were specially created. Truth didn't come with comfort, it came with chaos. And so institutions resist truth. They silence whistleblowers. They rewrite history. They censor, ridicule, and delay. Not because they hate truth, but because they know its power. A single truth, if taken seriously, can collapse an empire, a church, a corporation. Truth, if pursued without compromise, can end careers, sever relationships, dissolve worldviews. That's why it must be managed or, failing that, destroyed. Even on a personal level, truth hurts. The truth about who you are, what you've done, or what you've avoided. The truth about your parents, your faith, your dreams. To confront truth is to face the wreckage, to sift through the ruins of belief, hoping something still makes sense. Some never recover from it. Others emerge reborn. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche saw truth as a force, not a fact, something wild and dangerous, not static and pure. He warned that truth doesn't uplift it, destroys comfort, decency, and illusion. And only those strong enough to withstand that destruction could create something new. Because that's the paradox. Truth is violent, but it is also the prerequisite for creation. You cannot build a real life, a real system, a real philosophy on lies. But before truth can construct, it must deconstruct. Before it can offer peace, it must bring war. So if you want the truth, prepare for a funeral. Something will die: your pride, your certainty, your world. But only in that death can anything honest begin. Pain is the only honest teacher most ever meet. Nothing cuts through illusion like pain. It bypasses theory, dismantles pride, and ignores whatever mask you've chosen to wear. Pain teaches without permission. It doesn't wait for you to be ready. It doesn't explain its lesson in words. It simply arrives sharp, unrelenting, undeniable, and forces you to pay attention. For many, it's the first time they truly see. Comfort, on the other hand, is deceptive. It flatters you. It whispers that everything is fine, that you are fine, that the world makes sense. Comfort tells you to avoid confrontation, to maintain the illusion, to keep the peace even when the house is on fire. But pain tells the truth. It yanks you into the present. It says, "Look," and once you've seen, you cannot unsee. This is why the most transformative moments in a person's life are usually preceded by suffering, a loss, a betrayal, a failure, an illness. These are not simply events, they are disruptions. They crack the narrative. They reveal what's been hidden, denied, or repressed. Pain exposes your dependencies, your delusions, your fragility. It shows you where you've built on sand. Philosophers like Schopenhauer and Nietzsche understood that pain was not an anomaly. It was the rule. Life, at its core, is struggle. We are born into a world of uncertainty, aging, and death. The quest for happiness often distracts from this truth, but it doesn't erase it. Pain reminds you of your limits. It reminds you that control is often an illusion. It reminds you that life doesn't owe you comfort. And yet, pain doesn't just strip, it reveals. It teaches you who you are when everything else is gone. When the job is lost, the relationship collapses, the body fails. What remains? Pain introduces you to yourself. Not the curated version, but the raw one. And from that rawness comes clarity. You learn what matters. You learn what endures. You learn what must change. Most people resist pain. They medicate it, suppress it, rationalize it. But in doing so, they miss the message. Pain is not always an enemy. It is often a guide. It is the body's way of saying, "This isn't working. It is the soul's way of saying, wake up. It is life's way of saying, there is something you need to face. The lessons learned through pleasure are shallow. The ones learned through ease are forgettable. But the lessons carved by pain, those stay. They shape how you move, how you speak, how you love. They humble you. They deepen you. They make you real. This doesn't mean you should seek pain. But when it comes, and it will do not run, listen, pay attention, because for many, pain is the only teacher they ever truly hear. And though it teaches with fire, its truth is almost always pure. If your beliefs are comfortable, they are probably lies. Beliefs are not supposed to soothe, they are supposed to confront. They are not there to protect your worldview, but to challenge it. When a belief feels good, reassuring, or conveniently aligned with your lifestyle, that should be the first red flag. Comfort is not a reliable signal of truth, it is often the byproduct of conformity. And in a world built on narratives, systems, and power structures, comfortable beliefs are usually the ones designed to keep you docile. Most people inherit their beliefs. They absorb them from family, culture, media, religion, or education. These beliefs are rarely interrogated because they work, they fit. They allow the person to navigate life with minimal friction. But what is easy to live with is often difficult to defend under scrutiny. That's because many beliefs are tailored not for truth, but for utility. They're meant to simplify life, reduce uncertainty, and reinforce group identity. Comfortable beliefs tend to avoid ambiguity. They offer clear villains, easy heroes, neat solutions. They preserve your self-image. They tell you you're good, that your side is right, that your suffering is meaningful, that justice is inevitable. But the truth is rarely so generous. The truth is murky, painful, and disorienting. It forces you to reconsider your role in systems you thought you were separate from. It makes you question whether your values are deeply held or simply inherited. Friedrich Nietzsche warned that people don't want truth, they want reassurance. Beliefs that disturb the ego are avoided. Beliefs that reinforce identity are embraced. That's why echo chambers thrive, why dogma persists, and why ideology becomes religion. The more comfortable a belief, the more likely it has been shaped to fit your existing psychological and emotional needs, not objective reality. The most important beliefs you'll ever hold are the ones that made you uncomfortable when you first encountered them. They're the ones that forced you to let go of something, a relationship, a worldview, a sense of moral superiority. They disrupted your story. They left you exposed. And in that vulnerability, you found something closer to truth. If your beliefs never challenge your identity, they are probably tailored to it. If they always confirm your goodness, they're likely a defense mechanism. If they allow you to look away from suffering, inequality, or complexity, they're probably not beliefs at all, just psychological armor dressed as principles. To believe something true is to be constantly destabilized. It's to revise, to grieve, to admit you were wrong. Truth doesn't coddle you. It strips you down. It asks more of you than you want to give. And most won't follow it that far. They'll stop at the first sign of discomfort. They'll cling to the story that lets them sleep. So examine your beliefs, not for how logical they sound, but for how much they cost you. Because if they've never made you bleed, never made you rethink your life, never forced you to let go of an illusion, they might not be beliefs at all. They might just be lies you've told yourself to keep the chaos out. Freedom is terrifying, that's why most avoid it. The idea of freedom is seductive. It conjures images of open landscapes, limitless potential, and sovereign choice. But real freedom is not about doing whatever you want. It's about taking full responsibility for your existence. It's about living without the safety nets of ideology, tradition, or authority. And that kind of freedom, raw, unfiltered, and indifferent, is terrifying. To be free is to realize that no one is coming to save you. There is no predetermined path, no cosmic checklist, no divine plan tailored just for you. Your meaning must be made, not found. Your morality must be chosen, not inherited. Every decision you make becomes yours, not your culture's, not your parents', not your God's. That weight is too heavy for many. People talk about wanting freedom, but what they often want is permission. They want someone else to say it's okay. They want structured liberation freedom, with guidelines, with rituals, with assurances that they're still good. They want a menu of choices, not an empty field. But real freedom doesn't come with a map. It's you, naked in the wilderness, with nothing but your instincts and your courage. That's why so many opt for structure over sovereignty. They join institutions, cling to ideologies, adopt identities. These frameworks offer protection. They tell you what's right, what's wrong, what to believe. They give you a tribe, but they also limit you. They turn your freedom into a role. And because the role comes with meaning, people accept the trade. They prefer the comfort of boundaries to the anxiety of the open. Even rebellion is often a costume. People reject one system only to fall into another, the aesthetic of freedom, without its consequences. The revolutionary still needs a manifesto. The spiritual seeker still needs a lineage. The entrepreneur still needs the market's approval. Rare is the one who walks away from it all and builds from scratch, not to be seen, but to be real. Existentialist thinkers like Sartre understood this fear of freedom. They called it anguish, the dread that comes when you realize you are free to choose, and that every choice is a declaration of who you are. There's no one to blame, no script to follow, just you and the consequences. Most people recoil from that abyss. They want certainty, not responsibility. They want guidance, not authorship. And so freedom becomes performative. We wave flags, chant slogans, idolize choice while living in cages we've painted ourselves. The bars are invisible because we helped build them. We follow rules we never questioned, chase goals we never examined, and call it liberty. But it's obedience with better branding. Freedom doesn't feel good at first. It feels like falling, like solitude, like losing everything you were told would save you. But beyond that, fear is something honest. A life that is truly yours, not inherited, not outsourced, not borrowed. But to reach it, you have to stop pretending you want freedom and start confronting why it scares you so much. There is no virtue without sacrifice, and most won't pay. Virtue sounds noble: patience, courage, honesty, humility. These words are easy to admire, even easier to repeat. But they are not cheap. They cost something. True virtue requires sacrifice. You must give up comfort, convenience, safety, popularity, even love. And that's why, in most people, virtue remains an aspiration rather than a reality. To be patient means surrendering your need for control. To be honest means risking rejection. To be courageous means facing fear when escape is still an option. These acts are not born of words, but of pain. They ask you to do what you don't want to do, to suffer in the name of a higher principle, and very few are willing to pay that price when the bill comes due. Virtue, in its purest form, is anti-instinctual. The body wants ease. The ego wants validation. The mind wants certainty. But virtue often demands the opposite. It asks you to remain silent when you want to speak when silence would be safer, to walk away when staying feels easier, to stand firm when everything in you wants to fold. Society celebrates virtue but rarely supports it. It praises integrity until it costs profit. It uplifts bravery until it threatens stability. It rewards kindness until kindness gets in the way of efficiency. Virtue is honored in public, but punished in private. And that tension is why so many retreat into performance. People don't want virtue. They want the image of virtue. They want to be seen as good without having to sacrifice anything. They curate personas, signal morality, align with causes. But when it comes time to choose between principle and personal gain, principle usually loses. Because real virtue doesn't reward you. It isolates you. It costs you friends, jobs, influence. It's the hard road, the one without applause. Religious texts, philosophical traditions, they all emphasize sacrifice. The martyr, the sage, the prophet. These figures are not virtuous because they preached virtue. They lived it. And it broke them. That's the lesson people skip over. You don't get to be good without giving something up. Comfort and virtue rarely share the same room. This is why virtue can't be faked for long. Eventually, the test comes. The moment arrives when your values are no longer theoretical, when acting on them means loss. That's when you find out who you really are. Until then, you're rehearsing. And most won't go that far. They'll rationalize, delay, compromise. Not because they're evil, but because sacrifice hurts. It's easier to adjust the virtue than to suffer for it. To call cowardice caution, to call betrayal pragmatism, to call silence wisdom. That way, the self-image remains intact. But make no mistake, there is no virtue without sacrifice. You don't become good by thinking good thoughts. You become good by choosing principle over pleasure, over and over again. And that choice will always cost you something real. Humans don't change, they adapt their masks. What passes for personal transformation is often little more than costume change. People say they've evolved, but more often they've simply refined their presentation. They become more efficient at playing the role expected of them, or the role that yields better results. The core remains the same fears, desires, insecurities, instincts. What changes is the mask, adjusted to match the room. Social survival requires adaptation, and humans are unmatched in this regard. We become what our context demands. Around authority, we perform respect. Around peers, we perform wit. Around family, we perform stability. But these are performances calibrated not for truth, but for approval, safety, or power. The person beneath the mask may feel restless, hollow, or conflicted, but as long as the exterior holds, the world will play along. Even our so-called growth often follows this pattern. The shy person becomes confident, not by dissolving their fear, but by layering charm over it. The dishonest person becomes transparent, not by changing motives, but by learning better language. The manipulator becomes a leader. The addict becomes a biohacker. Same core, new packaging. Change happens on the surface. The mask just fits better now. Carl Jung called this the persona, the social mask we wear to function in society. It is necessary, even useful, but when we mistake it for our true self, we lose track of who we are. Worse, we think we've changed because our performance has improved. But performing wellness is not healing. Performing virtue is not transformation. It's a simulation that convinces others, and sometimes, tragically, ourselves. Real change is rare. It requires the collapse of identity, not its rebranding. It requires facing the parts of ourselves we hide, even from our own reflection. It demands radical honesty, not just about what we do, but why we do it. And most people, when they reach that threshold, step back. They'd rather update the mask than strip it away. Culture encourages this. Social media is a marketplace of masks. You're not rewarded for depth, you're rewarded for aesthetics. You're not seen for who you are, you're seen for what you signal. Even therapy, in its commodified form, can become a place to refine the mask. You work on yourself, so you can re-enter the world as a better product, more palatable, more functional, more efficient. But not necessarily more real. The deeper truth is that change threatens identity. And identity, for many, is a life raft in an ocean of uncertainty. So we paint it, decorate it, patch the holes, but we rarely dive in. Because diving means letting go of who we think we are and confronting who we might be without the mask. And so humans don't change, not often. They adjust. They evolve their image, not their essence. The mask grows more convincing, more seamless. And beneath it, the same mind loops through the same stories, still hiding, still afraid, still unseen. The greatest fear is not death, but insignificance. Death is inevitable. Everyone knows this. We talk about it, fear it, mythologize it. But underneath that fear lies something deeper, more haunting. The fear that our lives won't matter, that we will disappear, not just from the world, but from memory, that we will live and die and leave no mark, not even a ripple. This is the true dread, not non-existence, but irrelevance. People endure suffering, risk humiliation, and even court death, not to avoid dying, but to avoid being forgotten. They climb mountains, start wars, build companies, write books, have children. These aren't just life choices, they are defenses against oblivion. They are attempts to prove, I was here, I mattered. The monuments we build, the names we etch into history, the photos we post, they are all expressions of this deeper need. Religion exploits this fear perfectly. It promises eternal life, not necessarily because people want more time, but because they want to be seen forever. Heaven is not just paradise. It's proof that you mattered enough to be remembered by the divine. Hell, too, confirms your importance. You were judged, noticed, significant enough to be punished. What people truly fear is not punishment. It's being irrelevant even to God. This fear drives much of human behavior. Fame becomes a modern form of immortality. Legacy becomes currency. Even acts of destruction, terrorism, mass shootings, public scandal are often born from the desperation to matter. If I can't be loved, then let me be feared. If I can't be remembered for my virtue, then at least remember my name in infamy, anything but vanishing. Insignificance is a mirror few can look into. To consider that your life might be one among billions, your pain just another echo, your achievements forgotten within a generation, it's destabilizing. The ego cannot bear it. So it builds stories. It attaches to causes. It performs. And in those performances, we search not for truth, but for audience. Michel Foucault warned about the gaze of power, how we live not just for ourselves, but for how we are seen. But there is also the existential gaze, the need to be seen at all. We construct identity not just to express who we are, but to make sure we are noticed. Validation becomes visibility, and visibility becomes proof of significance. But what happens when the audience vanishes? When no one remembers? When the last person who knew your name dies? Most can't stomach that silence. And so they keep running, accumulating, broadcasting, branding, performing, not to live, but to leave a trace. Yet the irony is that meaning cannot be manufactured through force. You cannot outrun insignificance with followers or achievements. The only answer is acceptance, not of meaninglessness, but of impermanence, of living fully without needing to be eternal. That's freedom. But few reach it, because it requires letting go of the very thing we fear most, being nobody. Every moral system serves someone's interest. Morality presents itself as universal, a code of right and wrong etched into the fabric of the universe. But in practice, moral systems are human constructions. They are created within particular cultures, historical moments, and power structures. And they always, without exception, serve someone's interest. They reward certain behaviors, penalize others, and in doing so, maintain the dominance of particular groups, ideologies, or classes. Look at any moral doctrine, religious, secular, legal, and ask who benefits. The answers come quickly. Traditional religious morality often reinforces patriarchal authority, demanding obedience, sexual control, and fixed roles. These values don't emerge from divine revelation. They reflect the priorities of the institutions that codified them. The Church didn't just teach morality, it enforced a hierarchy. Modern secular morality, too, carries hidden interests. Capitalist societies emphasize values like hard work, ambition, and personal responsibility. Not because these are timeless truths, but because they align with the needs of an economic system that requires labor, competition, and consumption. Generosity is encouraged, but only within bounds. Charity is praised, but systemic change is discouraged. Kindness is commodified. Virtue becomes PR. Even our ideas of justice are shaped by power. What is legal is not always moral, and what is moral is not always legal, because the law reflects the interests of lawmakers. Crimes of poverty are punished harshly. Crimes of wealth are negotiated. The moral condemnation of theft, for instance, rarely extends to corporate exploitation. Steal a loaf of bread and go to jail. Steal pensions, destroy economies, and get a bonus. Michel Foucault showed how morality is used to produce docile bodies, individuals, who regulate their own behavior to fit the norms of society. These norms are not neutral. They reflect what the dominant class wants to see: predictability, productivity, compliance. You're taught that being good means being quiet, obedient, in control. And those who deviate, who are angry, different, non-conforming, are labeled immoral, dangerous, sick. Even in revolutions, moral codes are restructured to fit new interests. The oppressed become the oppressors. The language shifts, but the game remains. Every ideology has its saints and its sinners. And morality becomes a tool to justify violence, to sanctify power, to disguise control as virtue. This doesn't mean morality is useless, but it means we must ask harder questions. Who wrote these rules? Who enforces them? Who gains when they are followed? And who suffers when they are broken? Until we ask these questions, we are not ethical, we are indoctrinated. Morality is never neutral. It is never pure. It is always political. It always serves someone. The question is whether it serves truth or just authority, and whether you follow it out of conviction or out of fear. Utopia is always one purge away from hell. Utopias sell the dream of perfection, harmony, justice, equality, peace. But underneath every blueprint for a perfect society is the same unstated clause: perfection requires obedience. And those who don't conform to the dream must be removed, not because they are evil, but because their existence threatens the illusion. Utopias are fragile. They can't tolerate dissent. That's why every attempt to build one eventually reaches the same conclusion, that paradise must be protected by force. The moment a society declares itself utopian, it begins to decide who fits and who doesn't. The ideal citizen is defined. The model behavior is codified. And everything outside of that becomes a risk, a deviation, a flaw in the system. So it must be corrected. And if it can't be corrected, it must be eliminated. The road to hell is paved not just with good intentions, but with perfect blueprints. The most terrifying regimes in history didn't begin as nightmares, they began with dreams. Stalin's Soviet Union promised a classless paradise. Mao's China promised to free the peasant from feudal chains. Pol Pot's Cambodia dreamed of total equality. But to achieve those visions, millions had to disappear. Because human beings are messy. They don't all believe the same thing. They don't move in sync. And when reality didn't match the dream turned on reality. Utopias demand uniformity. They assume that perfection is not only possible, but objective. That once the right system is in place, everyone will be happy, and if they're not, something's wrong with them. But happiness is not universal. One person's dream is another's nightmare. And so the utopian state becomes an enforcer of a singular vision, wielding morality as a weapon. Dystopias aren't the opposite of utopias. They are their inevitable outcome. The surveillance, the propaganda, the purges, these aren't bugs in the system. They're features. They are what happen when ideals collide with reality. When the messiness of human nature meets the rigidity of perfect design, the more tightly you try to control a society in the name of good, the more brutal the control becomes. Even democratic societies flirt with this logic. Policies are passed in the name of safety. Freedoms are restricted in the name of harmony. Speech is policed in the name of tolerance. The utopian impulse is still there, just in softer clothing. But the danger remains. The willingness to sacrifice people for an ideal. To justify cruelty in the name of order. The real test of any society isn't how it treats the loyal, the aligned, the majority. It's how it treats the outlier, the misfit, the contrarian. Utopia promises a place for everyone, but it often means a place for everyone who obeys. And when obedience becomes the price of peace, the dream is already rotting. Every utopia has a graveyard. Not because perfection is impossible, but because it is enforced. And enforcement always comes with a cost. One purge away, and paradise becomes a prison. The dream becomes a doctrine. And doctrine, once sacred, becomes cruel. Suffering is the price of consciousness. To be conscious is to be aware. To see not just the world, but yourself, your flaws, your patterns, your impermanence. Animals suffer physically, but they don't reflect on that suffering. They don't imagine the future, regret the past, or dread their own extinction. Humans do. And that self-awareness is both a gift and a curse. It allows us to create art, meaning, and philosophy, but it also guarantees we will suffer in ways no other creature can. The moment you become conscious, suffering enters the room. You realize you are finite, that everything you love will one day be gone, that nothing lasts, not joy, not youth, not even memory. You realize that no matter how deeply you connect, you are ultimately alone in your experience. Consciousness gives you a front-row seat to your own mortality, and that awareness haunts even your happiest moments. Suffering isn't an interruption of life. It is woven into its fabric. The more conscious you become, the more deeply you feel it. Not just your own pain, but the pain of others. Empathy is a form of suffering. It opens you to the sorrow of strangers, to the weight of injustice, to the unbearable tenderness of watching others struggle. To be numb is to be shielded. But numbness is not consciousness. It is its opposite. This is why many avoid deep awareness. They anesthetize with distractions, consumption, entertainment, ideology. They seek pleasure not to celebrate life, but to escape it. Because when the noise stops, the silence is deafening. And in that silence is the truth. That life is uncertain, that identity is unstable, that even the self is a temporary construct. Consciousness reveals all this, and suffering follows. But suffering is not just torment, it is also clarity. It strips away illusion, it humbles, it deepens. The happiest people are not those who have never suffered, they are those who have suffered and integrated it, who have walked through the fire and emerged not with answers, but with wisdom. Not with certainty, but with presence. Buddhist philosophy begins with this premise. Life is suffering. But the goal isn't to escape it, it's to understand it, to stop resisting, to stop clinging. Western philosophy too wrestles with this. Nietzsche saw suffering as the source of depth, that without it, we would be shallow, fragile, untested. He called for its embrace not because it's good, but because it's inevitable, and because it forces transformation. Suffering is the tuition we pay for consciousness. It's the cost of being awake. And though we may curse it, we also learn from it. It's what drives compassion, creativity, courage. It reminds us that we are alive not comfortably asleep, but fully, painfully, gloriously awake. To challenge norms is to become a villain. Society does not reward those who question its foundations. It may flirt with the idea of rebellion, even idolize it in hindsight. But in the present tense, the norm breaker is almost always cast as the villain. Not because they are wrong, but because they are inconvenient. Norms exist to preserve order. To challenge them is to destabilize. And instability, even when necessary, is threatening. When someone questions what everyone else takes for granted, the roles, the rules, the rituals, they become a mirror. They reflect back the unexamined, the unearned, the absurd. And people don't like what they see. They lash out, not at the system, but at the person who dared to name the cracks in it. They shoot the messenger to protect the message. This is why prophets are stoned, whistleblowers are jailed, and iconoclasts are ridiculed. Those who challenge norms disrupt comfort. They force people to think, and thinking is labor. It demands change. It's easier to label the challenger as crazy, bitter, extreme. It's easier to cast them as a threat than to wrestle with what they're saying. Power structures rely on norms to function. Religion, education, family, law, all these systems are built on assumptions about how people should behave. When those assumptions are challenged, the whole structure wobbles. So the system retaliates. It uses media, language, tradition, even science to pathologize the rebel. To turn disagreement into deviance, to make the challenge a personal flaw rather than a systemic insight. This is how conformity is maintained, not through brute force, but through narrative. You're not wrong, you're immoral. You're not bold, you're dangerous. And once you're cast as the villain, the public doesn't just tolerate your punishment, they demand it. Because punishing you means restoring the illusion that everything is fine. Even in progressive movements, this pattern repeats. Every generation believes it's more tolerant than the last, but it still punishes the current heretics. Today's activist is tomorrow's statue, but only if they survive. Until then, they are mocked, marginalized, or erased. And when they are finally accepted, it's only because the system has moved on, not because it ever admitted it was wrong. Challenging norms is lonely. It means walking away from comfort, applause, and sometimes even safety. It means being misunderstood. It means being reduced to a caricature. But it also means being honest, being awake, being free. To challenge norms is to become a villain not because you are evil, but because you're early. And the world always resents what it's not ready to understand. Silence is often more subversive than rebellion. Rebellion is loud. It marches, chants, burns, disrupts. It demands to be heard, to be seen. But silence, real silence, can be more dangerous, more disorienting, more subversive. Because silence doesn't play the expected role. It doesn't feed the narrative. It doesn't respond to provocation. It leaves space. And in that space, others are forced to fill in the gaps, to question, to wonder, to doubt. Silence is not passivity. It is control. In a world obsessed with noise, with opinions, reactions, declarations, silence becomes unsettling. People are trained to interpret silence as absence. But silence, when intentional, is presence without performance. It is a refusal to participate in the script. It doesn't validate the terms of the argument. It doesn't concede the frame. It says, "I will not play your game, and I don't owe you an explanation." Power expects resistance to look a certain way. It is prepared for it. There are protocols for protest, methods for managing outrage, mechanisms for absorbing criticism. But silence, especially from those expected to speak, creates a disturbance that can't be measured. A silent dissenter is a blank space in a system designed to fill every slot. You can't debate silence. You can't spin it. You can't easily punish it, because it doesn't violate any rule, it simply refuses to engage. History shows this again and again. The silent protester, the monk on fire who said nothing, the artist who vanishes instead of performing, the citizen who stops showing up, stops voting, stops playing along. Their silence speaks volumes not because it says something specific, but because it refuses the expected ritual. It exposes the hollowness of the performance by opting out of it completely. Even in personal relationships, silence can be the most powerful statement. When someone stops arguing, stops defending, stops explaining, it shifts the dynamic. The other person is left with themselves, their noise, their need for validation, their control. Silence returns the burden of meaning to the one who insists on control, and often they can't carry it. This kind of silence is not cowardice. It's not avoidance. It's resistance without spectacle. It requires strength, restraint, and clarity. It demands a willingness to be misunderstood, misinterpreted, and mislabeled, and to not correct it, because the correction would mean stepping back into the script. Real silence means letting the misunderstanding burn. Foucault understood that power operates through discourse, through what is spoken, defined, categorized. Silence disrupts that machinery. It is the ghost in the machine. It cannot be measured, and therefore cannot be controlled. When rebellion is loud, it draws the lines. When silence holds, it erases them. And in that erasure, there is a deeper kind of threat. One that doesn't shout in defiance, but stands in stillness, unmoved, watching, present. The will to power does not ask for permission. Power, in its purest form, does not wait to be sanctioned. It does not plead or justify. It asserts. It takes. It moves. The will to power, as Nietzsche framed it, is not about dominance over others, but about the assertion of self in the face of resistance. It is the drive to shape reality, to overcome limitation, to affirm existence without needing validation. And that kind of force does not knock on doors, it kicks them in. Most people are conditioned to ask for permission, to seek approval before they act, to get consensus before they speak, to soften their ambition so it fits within polite parameters. But the will to power rejects that entire framework. It does not exist to be liked. It does not shrink to be palatable. It moves forward, even if it moves alone. This will is not brutality, it is creativity. It is the artist who doesn't wait for funding, the entrepreneur who builds without investors, the dissident who speaks when it's dangerous, the mystic who sees what others deny. All of them move not because they are allowed to, but because they must. Their impulse is not permissioned, it is inevitable. Society teaches deference especially to those without institutional power. Wait your turn. Don't cause trouble. Stay in your lane. But lanes are for traffic, not for people. The will to power carves its own lane or ignores the road entirely. It does not break rules for attention, but because it refuses to accept that the rules are sacred. Those who live by this will are often framed as arrogant, dangerous, or unstable. That's because they do not rely on external validation. They don't play the game of appeasement. And systems of control from religion to corporations depend on people who play that game. When someone steps outside of it and thrives, it exposes the illusion. It reveals that obedience was never necessary, only enforced. The will to power doesn't mean domination of others. It means domination of fear, of inertia, of the voices inside that whisper, wait until they say it's okay. It is the refusal to be shaped by cowardice. It's not about crushing, it's about creating. Not about winning, about becoming. And yes, this will threaten the status quo. Because it cannot be co-opted. It doesn't sell easily. It cannot be trained. It doesn't wait for a green light. It is its own light burning, moving, shaping the world by force of presence alone. Permission is for those who seek to be managed. The will to power does not ask, it acts. True freedom is isolation, and few survive it. Freedom is often romanticized as a state of liberation, of uninhibited expression, of limitless opportunity. But real freedom, the kind that strips you of obligation, dependency, and imposed identity, is isolation. It means standing alone, not because you've been cast out, but because you've chosen not to belong to anything that requires your silence. And very few can survive that. To be truly free is to detach from the frameworks that define most lives. Social roles, cultural scripts, institutional expectations, these provide structure. They tell you who you are, how to behave, and what matters. They offer comfort, belonging, and the illusion of meaning, but they also bind you. They demand conformity, and the moment you question them too deeply, you find yourself outside of them. That's where freedom begins. Not in rebellion, but in detachment. In the quiet, uncomfortable realization that no one is coming to rescue you, that your path has no map, that your truth has no audience. You don't just lose connection, you lose reflection. Without others to mirror your identity, you become amorphous, uncertain, and exposed. People crave freedom, but they also crave validation, and the two are often incompatible. True freedom means acting without applause, thinking without consensus, living without guarantees. It means confronting your own mind without distraction, And that confrontation is brutal. The silence is loud. The loneliness is sharp. The weight of choice is overwhelming. This is why most opt for managed freedom, a curated version that still fits within acceptable limits. You're allowed to be yourself, as long as yourself is recognizable. You can speak your truth, as long as it's in the right language. You can be different, but not too different. The moment you stop asking for permission altogether, you become dangerous. Not just to the system, but to the people still inside it. Even thinkers, artists, and mystics, those who push boundaries often retreat before full freedom. They surround themselves with disciples, movements, identities, because the alternative is solitude. And solitude is where you meet the void, the absence of meaning imposed by others, the absence of stories, not your own. In that space, you must build everything from nothing. And nothing is a terrifying place to start. Friedrich Nietzsche understood this. His free spirit was not a hero, but a wanderer, vulnerable, isolated, misunderstood. Not because the world rejected him, but because he had rejected the world's illusions. True freedom isn't empowering, it's destabilizing. It breaks you before it rebuilds you, and some don't make it through. Those who do are often changed beyond recognition. They speak in ways others don't understand. They live on the edges, not as exiles, but as those who no longer need to belong. Their freedom is not a gift, it is a burden they've chosen to carry. Few survive it. Even fewer seek it. Because true freedom is not about escape. It's about standing alone in the wilderness and not looking back.